Welcome, dear listener, to another journey into the unglamorous corners of history. I hope this evening, or morning, or afternoon, wherever you find yourself in the world, finds you comfortable, settled in for what will be a long exploration of a subject that popular culture has thoroughly romanticized, but that historical reality reveals to have been far darker than our entertainment suggests. Before we begin in earnest, a gentle invitation. If you find value in these deep dives into history's less celebrated truths, please consider subscribing to the channel. It costs you nothing, but it helps ensure we can continue producing these exhaustively detailed examinations of the past's uncomfortable realities. And if you've already subscribed, thank you. Your support makes this work possible. Tonight's subject is one that requires careful framing and significant content warnings. We'll be examining the reality of concubinage and sexual exploitation in Viking Age Scandinavia, specifically the institution of the frillur, the concubine who occupied a legal grey zone between wife and slave, and whose existence fundamentally contradicts the popular modern narrative about Viking gender equality. This will be a long video, well over 2 hours, because the subject demands thoroughness. We'll be discussing sexual violence, forced pregnancy, reproductive coercion, physical abuse, and the systematic dehumanization of women. If these topics are triggering for you, this may not be the right video for your current needs, and that's perfectly fine. Your well-being matters more than any historical examination. For those continuing, I want to establish something clearly from the outset. This is not entertainment in the traditional sense. This is education about historical realities that were brutal, unjust and traumatic for those who lived them. We're not here to sensationalise or to wallow in suffering, but rather to understand with clear eyes what life was actually like for women without power in Viking Age society. The truth matters, even when, especially when, it contradicts the comfortable narratives we prefer. Picture, if you will, the year 950 somewhere in coastal Norway. The popular image of Viking society focuses on raiders, explorers, craftsmen creating intricate metalwork, poets composing complex verse. And yes, all of that existed. But also existing simultaneously were women living in conditions of sexual bondage. Women who had no legal rights, whose bodies were not their own, who bore children they could not protect, and whose suffering was so normalised that legal codes discussed their exploitation with the same casual tone one might use to discuss livestock management. These women existed, they suffered, and their experiences deserve to be understood, not erased by our modern desire to romanticise the Viking Age as somehow more enlightened than other medieval societies. So settle in, dear listener. Make yourself comfortable, because we'll be here for quite some time. Perhaps you're listening in bed, hoping this will help you drift towards sleep. That's perfectly appropriate, and I hope the measured pace and exhaustive detail serve that purpose well. Perhaps you're listening during a commute, or while performing some repetitive task. Welcome, and I hope the historical examination provides substantive company. Wherever you are, whatever your reason for being here, I'm glad you've chosen to spend this time understanding a part of history that rarely appears in popular narratives, but that tells us crucial truths about power, vulnerability, and the systematic exploitation that occurs when legal systems fail to protect the powerless. Let us begin. When we speak of the Viking Age, we're referring to approximately 793 to 1066 CE, roughly 3 centuries bracketed by the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery at the beginning and the Battle of Stamford Bridge near the end. Geographically, we're focusing primarily on Scandinavia, modern Norway, Sweden and Denmark, with particular attention to Iceland as well, since Icelandic saga literature and law codes provide some of our richest sources for understanding Viking Age social structures. This was a period of dramatic expansion and change. Scandinavians raided, traded and settled across huge swathes of Europe, reaching as far as Constantinople and North America. But our focus tonight is not on those famous voyages, but on what life was like within Scandinavian communities themselves, specifically for the most vulnerable women. The physical environment of Viking Age Scandinavia shaped daily existence profoundly. This was, and remains, a region of dramatic seasonal variation, with long, dark winters where survival depended on adequate preparation and stored resources. Farmsteads were often isolated, separated by forests, mountains, and water that made travel difficult, especially in winter. Communities were small and relatively self-sufficient by necessity. This geographic isolation is relevant to our subject because it created natural barriers to escape for women in bondage. There was nowhere to run to, no neighbouring settlement close enough to reach on foot without resources, no authorities to appeal to even if one somehow travelled to larger settlements. The population of Viking Age Scandinavia was overwhelmingly rural, with most people living on farms or in small villages. Towns existed, trading centres like Hedeby, Birka, and later Dublin, but they were small by our standards and housed only a fraction of the population. Most people never travelled far from where they were born. Social organisation centred on the household as the basic unit, with extended family networks providing social structure. Legal systems varied by region but shared common features. They were based on assemblies called things, where free men gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and conduct community business. Note that phrase, free men. Women had limited legal standing, and enslaved or semi-enslaved people had essentially none. The economy was primarily agricultural and pastoral, with some trade and craft specialisation. Wealth consisted of land, livestock, portable goods like silver and jewellery, and, relevantly for our subject, people. Human beings could be owned, could be property, could constitute wealth. This fundamental acceptance of humans as property created the conditions within which the concubinage system flourished. When people can be owned, and when the legal system recognises such ownership as legitimate, exploitation follows with depressing predictability. Religiously, the period we're examining spans a major transition from indigenous Norse paganism to Christianity. The conversion process was gradual, uneven, and often politically motivated, occurring at different rates in different regions. Norway and Denmark began Christianizing in the 10th century, Sweden somewhat later, and Iceland officially converted around the year 1000, though pagan practices persisted alongside Christianity for generations. This religious transition is relevant because Christianity theoretically opposed concubinage and slavery, yet as we'll see, the practical effects of Christianization on the lives of exploited women proved disappointingly minimal. Theological positions and lived realities often diverge dramatically when those with power benefit from maintaining exploitative practices. The social stratification of Viking Age Scandinavia included several distinct categories. At the top were jarls, nobles with significant land and authority. Below them were carls, free farmers and craftspeople who owned property and had legal standing. And at the bottom were thralls, slaves with no legal rights treated as property. But our subject tonight occupies a peculiar space between these categories, the frillur, the concubine, who was not quite a thrall but nowhere near a free woman, existing in a legal grey zone that made her uniquely vulnerable in ways we'll be exploring in exhaustive detail. Before we examine the specific institution of concubinage, we need to understand the broader context of gender relations and sexual norms in Viking Age Scandinavia. This was a profoundly patriarchal society, where power flowed along male lines and where women's status derived primarily from their relationships to men: fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. Legal marriage was a transaction between families, involving bride price and dower negotiations, creating alliances and transferring property. A legitimately married woman, especially one from a prominent family, had some legal protections and rights. She could own property under certain circumstances, could seek divorce in specific situations, and had family connections that offered some measure of protection against the worst abuses. but these protections applied only to women whose marriages were recognised as legitimate, whose families had the power to enforce those protections, and whose behaviour conformed to social expectations. Step outside those boundaries, or be born outside them, and protections vanished. For women without powerful family connections, without legitimate marriage contracts, without recognised legal status, Viking Age society offered essentially no protections at all. And this is where the frillur enters the picture. A woman in the household, sexually available to the household head, bearing his children, but lacking the legal status of a wife, and therefore lacking any of the protections that status might have afforded. The saga literature that provides much of our narrative source material for the Viking Age presents a particular vision of this world. Sagas were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, mostly in Iceland, though they purport to describe events from the 9th through 11th centuries. They were composed by literate men, often with clerical training, for audiences interested in heroic ancestors, dramatic conflicts, and the deeds of powerful individuals. Women appear in sagas, sometimes quite prominently, but almost exclusively women of high status whose actions intersected with the male power struggles that form sagas' main narrative concerns. Lower status women appear in sagas primarily as background characters, servants, slaves, victims, and frillur. They appear occasionally, usually in passing, their presence noted but their experiences largely unexplored. When saga literature does give us glimpses of concubines' lives, it's typically filtered through the perspectives of free, powerful characters for whom the frillur is an object of desire, a source of conflict, or a plot device rather than a person with her own complex interiority. So while we'll draw on saga evidence throughout this examination, we must read these sources critically, understanding that they reflect the biases and limited perspectives of their elite male authors. Legal codes provide another crucial source type. The law codes compiled in medieval Iceland, primarily Gragas, offer extraordinarily detailed regulations about property, inheritance, violence, and social interactions. These codes discuss frillur explicitly, specifying what they could and couldn't do, what obligations their keepers had, very few, and what consequences might follow from various actions involving them. Legal codes are invaluable for understanding the formal structures of Viking Age society, but they have limitations. They tell us what was legally permissible, not necessarily what occurred in practice, and they reflect the perspectives of those who wrote and enforced laws, free men with property and power. Archaeological evidence provides our third major source category. Viking Age burials, settlement excavations, and artifact analysis offer physical evidence that doesn't depend on literary or legal sources' biases. When we examine skeletal remains of lower status women, we can see evidence of violence, malnutrition, hard labour, and repeated childbirth written directly in bone. When we study burial patterns, we see who received elaborate graves with abundant goods, and who was disposed of in marginal locations with minimal ceremony. Archaeology can't tell us individual women's names or specific stories, but it can confirm or challenge the pictures drawn by written sources, providing evidence that those sources sometimes try to obscure. Comparing Viking Age Scandinavia to other medieval societies reveals both similarities and differences. The concubinage system was not unique to Vikings. Comparable practices existed across medieval Europe, the Mediterranean world, and far beyond. What distinguishes the Viking Age frillur system is perhaps its unusual legal explicitness. Where some other cultures practiced concubinage while officially condemning it, Scandinavian law codes simply regulated it as an accepted feature of social organisation. This legal frankness provides historians unusually clear evidence for practices that other cultures obscured through euphemism or denial. Our thesis for this long examination is straightforward but important. The reality of Viking Age concubinage reveals a system of institutionalized sexual exploitation that fundamentally contradicts popular narratives about Viking society as somehow enlightened regarding gender. The frillur system was not an unfortunate aberration or a few isolated cases of abuse. It was a legally recognised, socially normalised institution that subjected women to conditions of sexual bondage, reproductive coercion, and comprehensive dehumanisation. Understanding this system requires confronting its full brutality without the softening euphemisms that often appear in popular treatments of Viking history. This examination matters for several reasons. First, accurate history matters. When we romanticise the past, when we project modern values onto historical societies that didn't share them, we do a disservice to historical truth, and we erase the suffering of real people who deserve to be remembered. The women who lived and died as frillur existed. They experienced real suffering. Their lives matter, even though, especially because, their experiences contradict comfortable narratives we might prefer. Second, understanding historical systems of exploitation helps us recognise contemporary parallels. The dynamics that enabled Viking Age concubinage, legal systems that failed to protect vulnerable people, economic structures that made exploitation profitable, social attitudes that normalised violence against certain categories of women didn't disappear with the Viking Age. They recur across different historical periods and cultures, taking new forms but following recognisable patterns. By understanding how exploitation operated in the past, we might better recognise and resist it in the present. Third, this examination offers a case study in how historical narratives get constructed and contested. The modern romanticisation of Viking culture, including claims about gender equality, reflects contemporary desires and agendas as much as or more than historical evidence. Understanding why certain narratives become popular while others remain marginalised tells us something important about how societies use the past to serve present purposes. The frillur whose experiences we'll be examining were erased from historical memory, not by accident, but through systematic processes that deemed their suffering unworthy of documentation or remembrance. Recovering their experiences requires active effort to read sources against their grain, and to centre those whom the sources marginalise. Over the next 2+ hours, we'll explore this subject through 25 thematic chapters, each examining a different dimension of the frillur's existence. We'll discuss their legal status, or rather, their legal non-existence. We'll examine how women became frillur through capture, purchase, or desperation. We'll explore the household dynamics that placed them under the authority of wives who often proved viciously cruel. We'll confront the sexual violence that defined their daily existence, the forced pregnancies that threatened their lives, and the agonizing reality of bearing children they could not protect from exposure or exploitation. We'll examine the physical and psychological toll of sustained captivity and abuse. We'll discuss the rare attempts at escape and the brutal punishments that followed. We'll explore how frillur were traded between men like property, how they aged into worthlessness and were discarded, and how their children inherited the stigma of their mother's status. We'll look at what happened when Christianization theoretically abolished concubinage, and we'll examine the archaeological evidence that confirms the written sources' testimony about violence and suffering. We'll also contextualize this system, comparing it to similar practices in other cultures, and examining the economic logic that sustained it. We'll discuss the subtle forms of resistance available to women with almost no power, and we'll confront how modern romanticization of Viking culture erases these women's experiences. Finally, we'll explore how the trauma and stigma created by this system persisted for generations after its formal abolition, leaving marks on Scandinavian culture that endured for centuries. This will not be an easy journey. The subject matter is dark, often disturbing, and unrelentingly grim. But these women's suffering deserves to be understood, not erased for our comfort. So let us proceed with appropriate seriousness, with recognition of the real humanity of those whose experiences we're examining, and with commitment to historical truth, even when that truth is difficult to confront. Let us turn now to the first dimension of the frillur's existence, her legal status, or more accurately, her legal non-existence. Chapter 1. Property, not partners. In the intricate web of Viking Age lore, there existed a category of women who occupied a space so legally ambiguous that they barely existed at all. The frillur, the concubine, held a position that defied easy categorization. She was not quite a slave, yet she possessed none of the protections afforded to a wife. She lived in the household, bore children, performed intimate labour, yet in the eyes of the law she was fundamentally property. To understand the reality of concubinage in Viking Age Scandinavia, we must first grasp this essential truth. A frillur had no legal personhood, no protected rights, no voice in the systems that governed every aspect of her existence. The legal codes of medieval Scandinavia, compiled in later centuries but reflecting earlier customs, are remarkably explicit about what a frillur could not do. She could not inherit property. She could not bring legal suit against anyone, including the man who kept her. She could not testify in legal proceedings. She could not enter into contracts. She could not protect her own children. In Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code, concubines appear in property inventories alongside livestock and tools, items to be accounted for when estates changed hands, but not persons with agency or rights. When a man died, his frillur might be redistributed among his heirs like furniture, or she might be freed, or she might be sold. She had no say in which fate befell her. What made this truly brutal was the legal paradox at the system's heart. A frillur was not technically a slave. She was not a thrall who could be bought and sold at market with iron collar and public transaction. Yet she could be given away as a gift, transferred to settle debts, or moved between households at her keeper's whim. She existed in a grey zone of unfreedom, neither fully enslaved nor remotely free. This ambiguity served a purpose. It allowed men to exploit women's bodies and labour without the legal obligations that came with either marriage or slave ownership. A wife had dower rights, inheritance claims, and family connections that afforded protection. A thrall, paradoxically, had some recognised economic value that encouraged preservation. A frillur had neither. Consider the case of Halgerdur Höskuldsdottir from Njal's saga, one of the most famous women in Old Norse literature. Her mother, Thorgerdur, had been a frillur before Höskul acknowledged her and elevated her status. Yet even in fiction, even in a saga that portrayed Halgerdur as proud, beautiful and formidable, the taint of her mother's status followed her. When Halgerdur quarrels with other characters, they throw her mother's concubinage in her face as an insult that cannot be answered. The daughter of a wealthy, powerful man, acknowledged and raised in his household, still carried the mark of her mother's legal invisibility. If even saga heroes' daughters bore this stigma, imagine the reality for children whose fathers never acknowledged them at all. The darkest aspect of this legal void was what it meant for a frillur's children. A man who kept a concubine had no legal obligation to acknowledge the children she bore. He could, if he wished, perform a ritual acknowledgement, sprinkling water on the infant, giving it a name, placing it at his knee. But he was not required to do so. Without acknowledgement, the child was legally fatherless, entitled to nothing, vulnerable to exposure. The practice of leaving unwanted infants outdoors to die. And the mother, lacking all legal standing, could not prevent this. She could not appeal to any authority, could not claim any right. She could only watch and hope that the man who had impregnated her through coerced sexual access would choose to let her child live. Imagine enduring 9 months of pregnancy, the agony of childbirth without adequate support, and then waiting to learn whether the infant you'd just brought into the world would be wrapped and fed, or carried out into the cold night and abandoned. So the next time we encounter narratives about Viking society, about its laws and customs, we might remember the women who existed in its legal shadows. We might remember that for every named woman in the sagas, there were unnamed frillur whose suffering left no literary trace, whose entire lives were lived in the negative space of a law. defined not by what they were permitted to do, but by the endless catalogue of what they could not. Chapter 2. Raids, Debt and Desperation. How did women become frillur in the first place? The routes into concubinage were multiple, but they all shared one characteristic. None involved genuine choice. Some women entered the status through capture during raids. Others were sold by desperate families. Still others were born into it, daughters of frillur who inherited their mother's legal non-existence. Understanding these pathways into bondage reveals how the concubinage system fed itself, constantly generating new victims from multiple sources, ensuring a steady supply of exploitable women. The Viking Age is famous for its raids, those lightning strikes against coastal settlements from Lindisfarne to the Mediterranean. What's often romanticized in popular culture as daring adventure had a specific economic logic. Raids were about acquiring wealth, and women were wealth. Young women especially were valuable commodities. They could be put to work immediately, they could be sexually exploited, and they could produce children who themselves became property. The Irish annals are full of references to Vikings carrying away captives, and while they don't always specify gender, other evidence makes clear that women and children were preferred targets. They were easier to control than adult men, less likely to successfully resist or escape, and more readily integrated into Norse households. Picture the experience of a young woman in a coastal Irish or Scottish settlement in the 9th century. Perhaps she was grinding grain when the shout went up. Perhaps she tried to run, or to hide in the church, or to grab a younger sibling. Perhaps she fought. But if she was young and healthy, she was valuable, and valuable things are not easily abandoned. The raiders who caught her had already calculated her worth as a commodity to be transported back to Scandinavia, to be sold in the slave markets of Hedeby or Birka or Dublin, or to be kept for their own use. The voyage itself was traumatic. Cramped conditions, rough seas, inadequate food and water, and the constant threat of violence from men who viewed her as property already acquired. Archaeological evidence from Dublin's Viking-era layers has revealed iron collars of various sizes, including some small enough that they could only have fit adolescent girls, perhaps as young as 12 or 14. These collars were not decorative. They were restraints, marked with ownership symbols, designed to prevent escape and to advertise status. A woman wearing such a collar was immediately identifiable as unfree, her bondage made visible on her body. The collars chafed, left permanent scars, and served as constant physical reminders of captivity. Some skeletal remains show distinctive wear patterns on cervical vertebrae consistent with years of collar wearing. A woman's servitude literally written into her bones. But raids were not the only source. In years of famine, when harvests failed and livestock died, desperately poor families sometimes made a calculation that haunts the historical record. A daughter sold into concubinage might be one less mouth to feed, and the transaction might bring enough resources to keep the rest of the family alive through winter. Some legal codes discuss the terms under which such sales were valid, treating the matter as a straightforward property exchange. The girl herself had no say. Perhaps she was told it was temporary, that the family would buy her back when times improved. Perhaps she went believing she was helping her siblings survive. But once in a household as a frillur, escape was nearly impossible, and families desperate enough to sell a daughter were rarely able to accumulate the resources to redeem her. It's hard not to wonder about those final moments before separation. The mother who couldn't meet her daughter's eyes, the father who told himself he had no choice, the siblings who didn't understand where their sister was going. We can scarcely imagine carrying that knowledge for the rest of your life, that your family chose to trade your body, your future, your personhood, for the possibility of their own survival. And perhaps they did survive. Perhaps your sacrifice kept them alive through that hungry winter. But you would never know, because you would never see them again. Chapter 3. The Household Hierarchy. Once a woman became a frillur in a household, she entered a hierarchy of brutal precision. At the top stood the man who owned the property and everyone in it. Below him was his legal wife, the husfreyja, who commanded the household's female labourers and controlled domestic resources. And somewhere near the bottom, above only the thralls perhaps, lived the frillur, sexually available to the master, subordinate to the wife, performing the most degrading labour, existing in daily proximity to the woman whose position she could never occupy, but whose hostility she could never escape. The psychological architecture of this arrangement was exquisitely designed to maximise suffering and prevent solidarity. The wife had reason to hate the frillur, who represented both sexual humiliation and potential economic threat if her children were acknowledged. The frillur could not appeal to the wife for protection, because the wife often proved the most immediate source of daily cruelty. And both women were ultimately powerless against the man who maintained this arrangement, who could play them against each other or punish both with equal impunity. It was a system that fragmented women's potential alliances and channeled their anger toward each other, rather than toward the structures that oppressed them both. The frillur's labour was comprehensive and degrading. She performed the heaviest household work, hauling water, processing waste, scrubbing floors, tasks that left hands raw and backs permanently bent. She ate separately from the family, often receiving inferior food, the scraps and leavings after others had eaten their fill. She slept in the coldest, dampest parts of the house, the storage rooms, the areas near the animals, anywhere but the family's sleeping chambers. In some households she was forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Her voice another thing she did not own. Every aspect of her daily existence reinforced her non-personhood, reminded her that she was present in the household but not part of it, used by it but never belonging to it. What made this truly brutal was the wife's legal authority over the frillur. A husfreyja could order physical punishment for real or imagined offences, and she faced no legal consequences for excessive cruelty. If a frillur was beaten bloody for serving food too slowly, or for catching the husband's eye, or for no reason at all beyond the wife's rage at her own powerlessness, none of this violated any law. Some saga accounts, though fictionalised, hint at the sadism this power enabled. Wives forcing frillur to work outdoors in winter storms until their fingers froze, wives scalding concubines with boiling water while preparing food, wives denying medical care after difficult childbirths, letting infections fester untreated. Even more horrifying, evidence suggests some wives took control of frillur's reproductive capacity through violence. Herbal abortifacients were known and used, but when those failed or were unavailable, physical trauma could induce miscarriage. A kick to the abdomen, a blow with a heavy object, a fall downstairs that might appear accidental, these methods left little evidence but achieved the goal of preventing rival children from being born. The law did not prohibit a husfreyja from beating a frillur, and proving intent to cause miscarriage was impossible. A woman could lose pregnancy after pregnancy to deliberate violence and have no recourse whatsoever. This reminds us that institutional hierarchies often enable cruelty by giving some victims limited power over others. When everyone is suffering under a patriarchal system, giving women authority over other women can fragment solidarity and redirect justified rage toward horizontal violence rather than resistance to the system itself. The husfreyja, trapped in her own marriage with limited agency, could exercise absolute power over the frillur. And this power, rather than creating alliance between women in similar positions of subordination to male authority, instead created a household divided against itself, precisely as designed. Chapter 4. No consent, no refusal. At the heart of the frillur system lay a truth so brutal it challenges euphemistic description. These women lived under conditions of permanent sexual availability, with no recognised right to refuse. This was not merely frequent sexual exploitation. This was a state of being in which a woman's body was not her own, in which every moment carried the potential for violation, and in which resistance meant torture or death. To understand the reality of Viking Age concubinage, we must confront this directly, without softening language or averting our gaze. Legal codes from the period are remarkably explicit about the sexual access rights that came with keeping a concubine. A man could use reasonable force to compel a frillur to comply with his demands. Reasonable was defined by the man himself, with no authority to whom the woman could appeal. If she resisted, her refusal could be legally interpreted as theft. She was withholding property, her body, her labour, from its rightful owner. Some codes specified appropriate punishments for frillur who resisted their duties, and these punishments range from beating severe enough to leave permanent scars, to starvation, to being locked in storage buildings without heat for days at a time. There were no protected periods. A woman menstruating, pregnant or recovering from childbirth had no recognised right to rest or recuperation. Some evidence suggests men deliberately targeted these vulnerable times, viewing a woman's physical weakness as making her even more easily controlled. Postpartum hemorrhaging, the infected tears from traumatic births, the exhaustion of late pregnancy, none of this granted respite. The system recognised no bodily integrity, no circumstance under which a frillur's needs superseded her owner's desires. She existed in a state of permanent vulnerability, never safe, never sovereign over her own flesh. Perhaps most disturbing of all, some legal texts discuss appropriate punishments for frillur who resist their duties, and the specificity of these discussions reveals how common resistance must have been. Women tried to protect themselves despite knowing the consequences. They said no despite knowing that no was not a word they were permitted to speak. And the legal system responded by codifying punishments designed to break resistance. Beatings that left visible scars as warnings to others, starvation that weakened the body too much to fight, isolation in freezing storage buildings that inflicted suffering while preserving the woman's utility once she submitted. Archaeological evidence provides the skeletal testimony that written sources often omit. One example, a woman's skeleton from a Norwegian farmstead, shows healed fractures to both forearms, the kind of defensive injuries that occur when someone raises their arms to protect their face and head from blows. She also had facial fractures that healed poorly, leaving asymmetry visible in the bone itself. She was buried without grave goods in a corner of the property, far from the main burial ground, typical of low-status women, likely thralls or frillur. Her bones tell a story her voice never could. She was beaten repeatedly over years, survived injuries that must have caused agonizing pain, and died still in bondage, her body disposed of with no more ceremony than one might give to a broken tool. How does a human being survive in such conditions? What does it do to the mind to live in a state where your body is never your own, where every moment contains the possibility of violation, where resistance brings only greater suffering? The answer, revealed in fragments across sources, is that many women did not survive, not psychologically and often not physically. The next time you encounter casual historical references to concubines or secondary wives, you might remember what those euphemistic terms disguise: women living in a state of legalized sexual torture, day after day, year after year, until death brought the only release available to them. Chapter 5. Pregnancy as punishment. If constant sexual availability was one horror of the frillur's existence, forced pregnancy was another, and perhaps an even more psychologically devastating one. To bear a child is to be vulnerable, to need support, to require recovery time. To bear a child you cannot protect, whose fate you cannot influence, whose very existence is subject to someone else's decision about whether they will be allowed to live. This is suffering of a particular and agonizing kind. Viking Age frillur endured pregnancy repeatedly, risked death in childbirth without adequate support, and then faced the possibility that their infants would be killed or taken from them. Motherhood, which in other contexts might bring status or joy, became another vector of exploitation and grief. The mortality statistics are staggering when we examine skeletal evidence of Viking Age women's lives. Maternal mortality rates likely range between 15 and 20%, meaning roughly one woman in 5 or 6 died either during childbirth or from subsequent infections. These rates apply to all women, but wives typically had access to experienced midwives, family members to support them during labour, and the resources to secure adequate recovery time afterward. Frillur had none of these advantages. Their labour might occur attended only by other low-status women with no expertise. They were expected to return to work as soon as physically possible. And if they developed infections or hemorrhaging, medical care might be delayed or denied entirely. Picture a woman in her 8th month of pregnancy, still hauling water because the work doesn't stop, her back screaming with pain, her swollen ankles barely supporting her weight. When her labour begins, perhaps she's attended by another frillur, or perhaps she's alone in a storage room, biting down on cloth to muffle her screams because making too much noise might anger the household. The labour lasts hours, maybe days. Something tears inside her, the kind of tearing that will leave her incontinent for the rest of her life, or that will fester into an infection that kills her in fevered agony over the next week. But let's say she survives. Let's say she delivers a living infant. Now comes the truly unbearable part, the waiting. A newborn in Viking Age Scandinavia was not automatically considered a member of the household. The infant had to be formally acknowledged through ritual, sprinkled with water, named, placed at the father's knee to symbolise acceptance. Until this acknowledgement, the infant was legally nothing, and the practice of exposure carrying unwanted babies out into the elements to die was both legal and common. For a frillur's child, acknowledgement was entirely at the father's discretion. He might acknowledge the baby, binding it to him and securing its survival, or he might not. The decision often depended on factors that had nothing to do with the infant itself. Whether the household already had enough children, whether resources were scarce that year, whether the baby was healthy and male or sickly and female. Evidence suggests frillur were sometimes deliberately impregnated repeatedly to increase their owner's wealth through child production. If the children were acknowledged, they became part of the household labour force or could be traded. If not acknowledged, they cost little to expose, and the woman could be impregnated again immediately. This brutal calculus treated women's reproductive capacity as a resource to be exploited with no concern for the physical devastation of back-to-back pregnancies, no thought for the psychological horror of bearing child after child with no assurance any would survive. One runic inscription, fragmentary and debated in interpretation, mentions a woman who died bringing forth her 8th winter, meaning either her 8th pregnancy or her 8th year of repeated pregnancies. Her grave contained evidence of multiple childbirths based on skeletal markers, but no infant burials nearby. Either the children had been buried elsewhere, or they had not been buried at all. Each pregnancy was a gamble with her life. Each birth risked infection, hemorrhage, or exhaustion. And each infant's survival depended on a decision she could not influence, made by the man who had impregnated her through coerced sexual access. She survived 8 of these experiences before her body finally gave out, 8 times facing the possibility of death, 8 times bearing a child she might not be allowed to raise, 8 times enduring the physical devastation of pregnancy and birth in bondage. This reminds us that reproductive coercion remains one of the most devastating tools of control. When pregnancy can be forced, when childbirth occurs without support, when children can be taken or killed at someone else's whim, the result is trauma compounded on trauma. The weaponization of the reproductive capacity that in other circumstances might bring hope or continuity. So the next time we hear historical references to large families, or high fertility in past societies, we might pause to consider whose fertility was being exploited, and whether any of those children were wanted by the women forced to bear them. Chapter 6. The exposure decision. The hours immediately following childbirth should be a time of recovery, of relief that labour has ended, of first tentative bonding with a new infant. For a frillur in Viking Age Scandinavia, these hours instead brought a different kind of agony, the wait. The infant lay wrapped in cloth, not yet named, not yet acknowledged, existing in a liminal state between life and death. And the woman who had just risked everything to bring this child into the world could only wait. Wait for the man who owned her to decide whether her baby would be permitted to live or would be carried out into the night and left to die of exposure. Infant exposure was not a shameful secret in Viking society. It was legal, openly discussed in law codes, and apparently common enough that it required no special justification. The decision belonged to the household head, typically the father if he chose to acknowledge paternity. The criteria were practical and cold. Was the infant healthy? Was it male or female? Could the household afford another mouth to feed this year? Were there already enough children? The infant itself was not yet considered a person with rights. It was a potential person, and that potential could be accepted or rejected based on economic and social calculations. For frillur's children, the odds were even worse than for legitimate infants. A wife's child carried no stigma and represented continuation of the family line. Exposure of such children occurred only in extreme circumstances of deformity or resource scarcity. But a frillur's child had no automatic claim to acknowledgement. The father might already have legitimate heirs and feel no need for more children. He might want to avoid the complication of illegitimate offspring. He might simply not care enough to bother with the ritual of acknowledgement. And so the frillur waited, perhaps for hours, perhaps for days, to learn whether the infant she could hear crying would be fed or would be carried away. What made this truly brutal was the mother's absolute powerlessness in the moment. She had no legal standing to argue for her child's life. She could not appeal to any authority. If she pleaded, she might anger the decision-maker and seal the infant's fate. If she remained silent, she lived with the knowledge that she had not even tried. Some saga accounts, though fictionalized, hint at the desperation of these moments. One saga describes a woman who attempted to hide her newborn daughter after the household had ordered exposure, wrapping the infant in her own clothing and concealing her in a storage room. When discovered, both mother and child were killed, the woman beaten to death for disobedience, the infant left exposed as originally ordered. This saga mentions this in passing, as an example of the consequences of disobeying household authority, with no apparent concern for the woman's perspective or her desperate attempt to save her child. Archaeological evidence provides context for understanding the scale of this practice. Sites like the Hambledon Roman villa in England, a different culture and period, but with similar practices, have revealed concentrations of infant remains, suggesting systematic exposure. While we have less direct evidence from Scandinavian sites, legal codes' casual references to exposure and the practice's continuation into the Christian period suggest it was common enough to be unremarkable. Each concentration of tiny bones represents dozens of individual decisions, dozens of mothers who endured pregnancy and childbirth only to have their infants killed within days of birth. The psychological impact of this experience is almost impossible to articulate. You have carried a pregnancy to term, feeling the child move inside you, wondering who they might become. You have survived the agony and danger of childbirth, risked death from hemorrhage or infection, felt your body torn and exhausted by the process. You have held the infant, heard their first cries, felt the primitive mammalian bond forming despite your captivity. And then you wait. You wait to learn if this being you've created will be permitted to exist. You have no power, no voice, no ability to protect the most vulnerable thing you've ever encountered. You can only wait and hope and watch as someone else, someone who did not carry or birth this child, decides whether it lives or dies. This reminds us that helplessness has layers. and that some of the deepest suffering comes not from what is done to us directly, but from watching harm come to those we love while being unable to intervene. That particular agony, the forced, witnessing of violence against your child, is a trauma that transcends historical period, a wound that may never fully heal. Chapter 7. Sexually transmitted infections. Among the many horrors of the frillur's existence, one of the most physically devastating and least discussed was the near certainty of sexually transmitted infections. In an era before germ theory, before effective treatments, before any real understanding of disease transmission, women subjected to repeated sexual exploitation inevitably contracted infections that caused chronic pain, progressive disability, and often death. And because these illnesses were not understood, they were typically blamed on the women who suffered from them, seen as evidence of moral corruption, rather than as the predictable consequence of sexual violence. The specific infections circulating in Viking Age Scandinavia are debated among historians. Gonorrhea almost certainly existed. Bacterial infections that produce similar symptoms appear in skeletal evidence across many historical periods. Syphilis's presence in medieval Europe is more controversial, with some scholars arguing it arrived only after 1492 contact with the Americas, others pointing to pre-Columbian European evidence. But the precise taxonomy matters less than the lived reality. Infections that caused burning pain during urination, constant discharge, progressive damage to reproductive organs, and eventual systemic disease existed and spread through sexual contact. Women subjected to repeated exploitation by multiple men in households or communities with no understanding of disease prevention inevitably contracted these infections. Picture the progression of untreated gonorrhea in a woman's body. The initial infection causes acute pain and discharge, but if she's fortunate, these early symptoms might resolve on their own, the body's immune response temporarily suppressing but not eliminating the bacteria. But the infection persists, ascending from the vagina into the uterus and fallopian tubes, causing pelvic inflammatory disease. This chronic condition brings waves of pain, fever, and progressive damage to reproductive organs. Scar tissue forms, creating blockages and adhesions. The woman develops chronic pelvic pain that never fully resolves. She might become infertile, though for a frillur, infertility might be the only mercy the disease offers. Or infections might occur in subsequent pregnancies, causing stillbirths or maternal death from sepsis. The darkest aspect of this suffering was the complete absence of effective treatment and the moral interpretation of symptoms. When a woman developed the discharge and pain characteristic of these infections, she was seen as polluted, as emanating corruption from within. Some medical texts from the period describe women's ailments in euphemistic terms, but the treatments they recommend, herbal pessaries, bloodletting, fumigations, were not merely ineffective, but often actively harmful, introducing new infections or causing additional damage. And the blame always fell on the woman's suffering, never on the men who had infected her through coerced sexual contact. Evidence of these infections appears in skeletal remains of lower status women from the period. Some female skeletons show bone changes consistent with advanced syphilis, if that identification is correct, while others show pelvic abnormalities suggesting chronic infection and inflammation. One particularly tragic set of remains from a Norwegian farm site showed a young woman, perhaps 18 to 25 years old, with severe pelvic inflammation markers and a fistula, an abnormal opening between vagina and bowel or bladder, often caused by traumatic childbirth or chronic infection. This condition would have left her perpetually leaking waste, in constant pain, socially isolated by the smell and visible symptoms. She was buried without grave goods in a marginal area of the property, almost certainly a low-status woman, possibly a frillur, who suffered alone until infection or related complications killed her. The horror compounds when we consider that frillur were often blamed for infections that spread through the household. If a man develops symptoms after exploiting a concubine, The concubine was at fault for being diseased. Never mind that he likely infected her in the first place, or that she had no ability to refuse contact. This blame carried consequences. Reduced food rations for being useless, increased violence, or being turned out of the household entirely to beg or starve. A woman whose body bore the evidence of her own victimization was punished again for that evidence. So the next time we encounter historical discussions of immorality or corruption in women's bodies, we might consider how victims of sexual violence have been blamed across centuries for the health consequences of their victimization. We might remember that disease, shame and stigma have long served to compound suffering rather than to address its causes, and that this pattern persists into our own time with contemporary STI stigma that disproportionately affects women and disadvantaged populations. Chapter 8. The Gifts of Concubines. If we needed further evidence that frillur were treated as property rather than persons, we need only examine how they were transferred between men. Concubines were given as gifts to seal alliances, as rewards for loyal service, as gambling stakes in games of chance, or as compensation for insults and injuries. These transactions were recorded in saga literature with the same casual tone used to describe gifts of weapons, horses, or silver. The women themselves had no voice in these transfers. They were not consulted about whether they wished to change households. They simply woke one day to learn they now belonged to someone else, and they were expected to comply immediately with this new owner's demands. The diplomatic function of these gifts reveals how thoroughly women's bodies served as currency in male power networks. When a Jarl wished to secure an alliance with a powerful neighbour, he might send gifts designed to display wealth and generosity: fine cloth, worked metal, livestock, and women. The women were valued for their youth, their appearance, and their potential utility as sexual partners and labourers. Some gifts were specifically of pregnant frillur, transferring both the woman and the unborn child as a package deal, a 2-for-1 commodity exchange. Other gifts were of women past childbearing age or injured women being discarded to free up resources in the originating household. Less valuable gifts, but gifts that still serve to acknowledge relationships and obligations between men. Let us now turn to what such a transfer meant for the woman experiencing it. Imagine you have spent years in a household. You know the routines, the personalities, the dangers. You've developed small strategies for survival. You know which tasks to complete quickly to avoid beatings, which corners to hide in when the household head is drunk, which other women might share food when rations are short. This knowledge is your only asset, the accumulated wisdom of survival in captivity. And then one morning you're told you're leaving. You're being given to a stranger, a man you've perhaps never seen, in a household you don't know, in a location that might be days of travel away. Everything you've learned about survival is suddenly useless. You must start over, in new captivity, with new dangers you cannot yet predict. The sagas record these transactions with remarkable casualness. One Norwegian chieftain gifted 3 Irish women to a visiting Jarl, described in the same breath as gifting horses and silver arm rings. Were these women young or old? Mothers or childless? How long had they been in his household? Had they been captured together or separately? Did they know each other, take comfort in each other's presence? We don't know, because the saga doesn't care. They were items in an inventory, units of value exchanged between men. Their own experiences, their fear or grief or resignation, were beneath notice. Perhaps most disturbing were the transfers that occurred as gambling stakes. Some saga accounts mention men wagering their concubines in games of chance, dice, board games, contests of skill. The women sat nearby, perhaps serving food or drink, listening to men argue over whether one concubine was worth the same as another, whether a young woman was worth 2 older ones, whether a pregnant woman should count as 1 stake or 2, and then the game concluded, and ownership changed hands based on the fall of dice or the movement of game pieces. The loser handed over his stake, The winner collected his prize, and the woman, who had done nothing, decided nothing, controlled nothing, found her fate altered by random chance in a game she couldn't influence. These transfers also meant repeated trauma of new exploitation. Each new household meant new men with new cruelties, new hierarchies to navigate, new wives who might hate you for existing. A woman might be transferred multiple times over her life, passed between men like a tool that still had utility. Each transfer was a small death, the loss of any tenuous stability, the renewed vulnerability of not knowing what fresh horrors awaited. And there was no escape, no appeal, no authority to whom you could say, "Please, not again. I cannot bear another new captivity." This reminds us that trafficking is not just about movement across borders, but about the fundamental treatment of human beings as property that can be transferred at will. When people are owned, they can be traded, and each trade fractures their lives again, denies their personhood again, reinforces their status as objects rather than subjects. The movement itself, the being given away, is an act of violence that erases agency as completely as any physical assault. Chapter 9. When your value expires. One of the most chilling aspects of the frillur system becomes apparent when we ask a simple question. What happened to these women as they aged? Youth and reproductive capacity were the primary sources of a concubine's value in the brutal calculus of Viking Age household economics. A young woman could bear children, could perform heavy labour, could be sexually exploited without visible aging diminishing her appeal to her keeper. But women age. Bodies wear out, especially bodies subjected to repeated pregnancy, inadequate nutrition, and years of brutal labour. Fertility declines and eventually ceases. And when a frillur could no longer provide the specific forms of exploitation that had defined her utility, what became of her? The evidence suggests several possible fates, none of them merciful. Some elderly or infertile frillur were simply turned out of the household, expelled to fend for themselves in a society where an unattached woman with no resources and no family connections had virtually no survival options. Turned out meant in most cases a slow death from starvation and exposure. A woman might linger at the edges of settlement begging for scraps, sleeping in animal shelters or storage buildings when she could find them, her body gradually failing from malnutrition and cold. Others were killed outright when they became too weak to work effectively, a pragmatic solution to the problem of an unproductive mouth to feed, no more legally problematic than culling a lame horse. Picture an aging woman in her late 40s or early 50s, old by Viking Age standards, especially for someone who has endured decades of exploitation. Her back is permanently bent from years of hauling water. Her teeth are mostly gone, making it difficult to eat even the poor quality food she's allocated. Her hands are gnarled with arthritis, the joints swollen and painful, making even simple tasks agonizing. She has borne perhaps 6 or 8 children over her fertile years, and the repeated childbirths have left her with prolapse and incontinence. She's no longer pregnant, her menses having ceased some years ago. She can still work, but slowly, painfully, less efficiently than a younger woman. And efficiency is all that matters. Archaeological evidence provides disturbing confirmation of these patterns. Some excavations have revealed the remains of elderly women in marginal burial locations, field edges, property boundaries, refuse heaps, buried without ceremony or grave goods. One skeleton from a Norwegian farmstead showed an elderly woman, perhaps 50 to 60 years old, with severe malnutrition markers in her bones, healed fractures that had set poorly, and evidence of having lived for some time exposed to the elements before death. The location of her burial, in a midden heap alongside animal bones and broken pottery, suggests the household's contempt for her even in death. She was disposed of, not mourned, her decades of exploited labour earning her no dignity at the end. The darkest reality was the absolute lack of any social safety net or recognised obligation toward these women. A wife, no matter how aged or infirm, retained her legal status and her family connections. Her children, if she had raised them successfully, owed her support in old age. A frillur had none of these protections. Her children, if any had survived and been acknowledged, were under no legal obligation to support her. Often they didn't know her. Children of concubines were frequently raised separately from their mothers or given to other households entirely. The household that had exploited her labour and body for decades owed her nothing once she ceased to be useful. She had no savings, no property, no legal standing to claim compensation for years of forced service. She was simply discarded. Some saga references hint at this cruel endgame. One saga mentions an old woman, described dismissively as useless now, who was left behind when a household moved to a new farmstead. She was too weak to travel, too old to be worth the effort of bringing along. The saga notes this in passing, without comment on her fate, as one might mention leaving behind a broken wagon wheel. We can imagine her final days, alone in the abandoned buildings, unable to forage effectively, waiting for death from starvation or exposure. Perhaps she hoped someone would return for her. Perhaps she knew no one would. Either way, she died alone, unmourned, the final indignity after a lifetime of exploitation. So the next time we encounter discussions of how societies value their elderly, we might remember that societies have always made choices about whose age deserves respect and whose age deserves abandonment. We might consider how easily people are discarded when their economic utility ends, and how gender and status intersect to determine whose life retains value past reproductive years. The casual cruelty of aging in bondage reminds us that without legal protections and social support systems, vulnerability compounds over a lifetime until it becomes a death sentence. Chapter 10. The Children of Frillur. The suffering of frillur extended beyond their own lives into the next generation. Children born to concubines inherited their mother's stigma, carrying throughout their lives a mark they had done nothing to earn. Even when acknowledged by their fathers, these children occupied a permanently inferior legal and social position. They were tainted by unfree blood, excluded from full inheritance rights, barred from certain marriages and positions of authority. The shame was heritable, passed down through generations, creating family lines marked as inferior for centuries after the original concubinage that created the stigma. Legal codes from across Scandinavia specified the disabilities affecting children of frillur. They typically inherited only a fraction of what legitimate children received, perhaps a third or a quarter of a share, or sometimes nothing at all if the father chose not to acknowledge them in his will. They could not hold certain religious or political offices. They faced restrictions on whom they could marry. Some high-status families explicitly forbade matches with anyone of unfree ancestry, which included descent from concubines. These legal disadvantages, combined with social stigma, meant that even a wealthy, powerful father could not fully legitimize his concubine-born children. The stain persisted. Let us imagine the experience of a child growing up with this knowledge. Perhaps your father acknowledged you, gave you a name, allowed you to be raised in his household. This is more than many children of frillur received, and you're meant to be grateful. But you quickly learn that you are different from your father's legitimate children. They inherit his best lands, his titles, his full name and reputation. You receive scraps. When the family is introduced, you're mentioned last, if at all. When marriages are arranged, your siblings make advantageous matches, while yours, if you marry at all, connects you to families of similarly compromised status. You bear your father's name, but not his full legitimacy, his genetic legacy, but not his complete acceptance. What made this truly brutal was that the stigma could justify violence with reduced legal consequences. Some legal codes specified that children of frillur could be killed by their father's legitimate children, with lesser penalties than would apply for killing a free person of unblemished ancestry. Their lives were literally valued as less under law. This created situations where half-siblings might view each other as rivals, whose elimination was both practically advantageous and legally permissible. A concubine-born child lived knowing that his or her legitimate half-siblings had both motive and opportunity to kill them, with law offering minimal deterrent. Saga literature provides numerous examples of characters marked by their mother's status as frillur. Hrappa in Laxdæla Saga, whose mother was a concubine, is described as perpetually angry, violent, and uncontrollable, the saga implicitly linking his character flaws to his birth status. Whether the historical Hrappa was actually more violent than other saga figures is unknowable, but the literary pattern is clear. Concubine-born characters are depicted as tainted, as carrying something corrupt or inferior in their blood. This literary tradition both reflected and reinforced social attitudes that treated these children as permanently compromised by circumstances of birth they could not control. The psychological impact of inherited shame is difficult to overstate. You are marked from birth, defined by your mother's exploitation before you drew your first breath. Everything you achieve is contextual, impressive for someone of your background, remarkable despite your ancestry. You can never simply be yourself, simply be accomplished or admirable. You're always your mother's status first, your own person second, and you carry the knowledge that your mother's suffering, her repeated rape, her bondage, her legal non-existence, is treated not as an injustice but as something shameful that taints you by association. This reminds us that stigma is inherited, that systems of exploitation leave lasting marks across generations. We might consider how children are punished for their parents' circumstances in contemporary society, how poverty, incarceration, immigration status, and other markers create disadvantages that span generations. The children of frillur, marked forever by their mother's bondage, remind us that breaking cycles of stigma requires active intervention, and that letting the past be past without reckoning with inherited disadvantage simply perpetuates injustice across time. Chapter 11. The penalties for running. In the face of such comprehensive brutality, the question arises, why didn't frillur simply escape? The answer reveals how thoroughly the system was designed to make escape impossible, not just difficult, but genuinely unachievable for most women. The barriers were multiple and overlapping: geographic isolation, lack of resources, absence of legal identity, the danger of winter climates, and punishments so severe that even contemplating escape required courage bordering on suicidal. And for the rare women who did attempt to run, the consequences were designed not merely to punish, but to serve as permanent warnings to others. The geographic reality of Viking Age Scandinavia created a natural prison. Farmsteads were often isolated, separated by miles of difficult terrain, dense forests, boggy lowlands, mountain passes that became impassable in winter. A woman who fled had nowhere to go. She could not simply disappear into a city, because cities were few and small, and strangers were immediately noticeable. She could not seek help from authorities, because she had no legal standing to bring complaints. She could not travel freely, because free travel required resources, food, proper clothing, sometimes payment for passage, that she did not possess. And she could not survive alone in the wilderness for long, especially during the brutal Scandinavian winters when exposure could kill in hours. Even if a woman managed to physically leave a farmstead, she faced immediate practical barriers. She had no money, no food stores, no warm clothing beyond what she wore. She likely had no idea of the broader geography, where settlements lay, which directions led to potential help, how far she would need to travel. If she headed toward the coast hoping to find passage on a ship, she would need to somehow secure that passage without resources or legal identity. If she headed inland hoping to lose herself in the wilderness, she faced starvation and exposure. If she sought refuge with other households, she risked being returned to her owner for the bounty that was typically offered for capturing runaways. Picture a woman making this desperate calculation. You have endured years of exploitation, perhaps decades. Your body bears the scars of it, the healed fractures, the worn joints, the internal damage from repeated pregnancy. You're exhausted, chronically undernourished, and you have no skills for wilderness survival, but the thought of one more day, one more night in this household has become unbearable. Perhaps a recent beating was particularly severe. Perhaps you've just learned your latest child will be exposed. Perhaps you've simply reached the limit of what a human being can endure. So you run. You wait for a moment when supervision lapses, and you run into the forest with nothing but the clothes on your back and a desperate hope that anything has to be better than this. What made escape attempts truly brutal was what happened when runaways were caught, and most were caught. The saga evidence includes references to women who escaped and were recaptured, and the punishments were designed to be both devastating and visible. One saga account describes a frillur who ran and was caught. She was hamstrung. The tendons in her legs were deliberately cut, crippling her permanently, ensuring she could never run again. She was then returned to service as a permanently disabled woman who could still perform some seated work but who would never again have the physical capacity to flee. Her crippled body became a walking warning to every other woman in the household about the consequences of resistance. Archaeological evidence provides chilling confirmation. Some excavated female skeletons show signs of deliberate tendon cutting in the leg bones, injuries that would have been immediately and permanently crippling, that could not have occurred accidentally, and that left distinctive marks on the bone itself. These women lived for years after these injuries, the bone showing evidence of healing and adaptation. They survived as cripples in bondage, their mutilated bodies serving as permanent testimony to the price of attempted freedom. We cannot know their names, cannot hear their voices, but their bones speak. They tried to escape, they were caught, they were crippled as punishment, and they lived on in that condition until death finally released them. Other punishments for escape attempts included branding, marking the face or hands with burns that would permanently identify the woman as a runaway, starvation severe enough to leave permanent effects, or being chained or collared in ways that restricted movement. Some women were sold after escape attempts, sent away from any familiar geography to places even more remote, where they had even less hope of finding their way to safety. The punishment was never merely confinement. It was always calculated to inflict lasting damage and visible warning. This reminds us that systems of control are often designed precisely to make escape impossible, not through walls alone, but through eliminating alternatives. When every direction leads to death or recapture, when the act of running is punished so severely that the punishment itself becomes disabling, resistance requires extraordinary courage. And when we encounter historical records that say few attempted to escape, we should understand that as evidence not of contentment, but of a system so brutally effective that it crushed hope itself. Chapter 12. When exploitation becomes public. Among the many dimensions of horror in the frillur system, one of the most psychologically devastating was the semi-public nature of some sexual exploitation. The assault of concubines sometimes occurred not in private, but during feasts and gatherings, in halls where other household members and guests could witness. This publicity served multiple functions. It demonstrated the exploiter's absolute power. It normalized violence by making it unremarkable and communal, and it destroyed any remaining sense that the frillur's suffering was acknowledged as suffering at all. When violence becomes entertainment, when witnesses do nothing, the isolation and dehumanization of the victim reaches its most complete form. Saga accounts, though fictionalized, provide glimpses of this public exploitation. References to men taking women in the hall during festivals appear with the same casual tone as descriptions of eating and drinking. Some sagas describe drunken warriors demanding access to household women as part of hospitality during extended visits. The husfreyja was expected to tolerate this, and the women themselves had no recourse whatsoever. Refusal meant immediate violence, but compliance offered no protection either. The assault would simply occur, witnessed by dozens of people, and life would continue as if nothing had happened. Let us turn now to what this meant for the women experiencing it. Imagine being summoned to serve at a feast. The hall is full of men, drinking heavily, their voices loud, their behaviour increasingly unpredictable. You move carefully, trying to be invisible, knowing that drawing attention is dangerous, but that failing to respond quickly to demands is also dangerous. And then a hand grabs your arm, or you're shoved toward a corner, or you're dragged toward a side room while men laugh and make crude jokes. And it happens in full view of the household, in full view of guests, and no one intervenes. No one even stops talking. Your assault is so unremarkable that it doesn't interrupt the conversation. The darkest aspect of this public exploitation was how it enlisted witnesses as participants in the dehumanization. Everyone present became complicit through their inaction, their continued feasting and drinking while assault occurred steps away. Some men might have felt discomfort but said nothing because intervention would risk their own social standing or relationship with the host. Women present, wives, daughters, might have felt horror but were powerless to act and perhaps relieved that the violence was directed at the frillur rather than at themselves. The frillur learned that even in a room full of people she was utterly alone, that her suffering was so normalised that it didn't register as worth noticing. Evidence suggests some particularly cruel men deliberately maximise the public humiliation. Some sources hint at frillur being forced to serve naked at feasts or being assaulted in the main hall, rather than in more private spaces, the visibility itself part of the violence. This served as demonstration, a display of absolute power over another human being, a performance of dominance for an audience. The message was clear to everyone present. This is what power looks like. This is the difference between those who have rights and those who don't. This is how thoroughly a person can be reduced to an object. The psychological damage of public assault compounds the trauma of private violence. When assault occurs in private, the victim might tell herself that at least it's hidden, that others don't know, that she can maintain some public dignity. When assault occurs publicly and no one intervenes, that small comfort is stripped away. Everyone knows, everyone saw, and everyone's inaction confirmed that your suffering doesn't matter, that your humanity is not recognised, that you exist beyond the bounds of anyone's concern or protection. You are isolated in a room full of people, suffering in full view of witnesses who have collectively decided that what's happening to you is not worth disrupting their evening. So the next time we encounter discussions of bystander intervention or collective responsibility, we might remember how witnessing without acting becomes a form of participation in violence. We might consider how systems normalise cruelty by making it public and unremarkable, and how the presence of witnesses who do nothing can intensify rather than alleviate a victim's suffering. The frillur assaulted in view of feasting halls remind us that visibility alone does not ensure protection, and that the choice to look away is itself a moral act with consequences. Chapter 13. Deliberate Impregnation by Multiple Men. The nightmare of sexual exploitation could take an even darker form in some households. The deliberate use of concubines by multiple men, creating ambiguity about paternity. This practice served a specific function in the brutal logic of the system. When multiple men in a household, perhaps a father and his adult sons or brothers sharing a farmstead, had ongoing sexual access to the same frillur, determining which man had fathered any resulting children became impossible, and this impossibility freed all of them from any obligation to acknowledge or support the offspring. Uncertainty became a shield for irresponsibility, and the woman's body became the site where accountability was deliberately erased. Legal texts from the period discuss how to determine paternity when multiple men had shared use of a concubine. The language is telling, shared use, as if the woman were a communal tool rather than a person. These discussions treat paternity determination as a property dispute. Who owns the child? Who bears the cost of raising it? Who might benefit from its labour? The woman's experience, bearing a child whose father she might not even be certain of, being repeatedly exploited by multiple men, watching those men argue over whose responsibility the resulting infant represents, is completely absent from these legal considerations. Picture the lived reality of such a situation. You're kept in a household with multiple men who view you as communally available. Perhaps it's a father and his 2 adult sons. Perhaps it's 3 brothers sharing a farmstead. Each has unsupervised access to you. Each exploits that access. You become pregnant, an inevitable outcome given the circumstances, and as your pregnancy advances, the men begin calculating. Is the child likely to be healthy? Male? Worth the resources to raise? And crucially, whose responsibility is it? They might argue among themselves, each claiming the child is probably someone else's. Or they might simply agree that since no one can prove paternity, no one needs to acknowledge the child. What made this practice truly horrifying was how it systematized the denial of responsibility. In cases where a single man kept a frillur, there was at least some possibility, however slim, that he might acknowledge her children out of clear paternity. But when multiple men had access, that slim possibility disappeared entirely. The deliberate creation of ambiguity became a strategy for ensuring that no man needed to acknowledge any children the woman bore. The infant could be deemed fatherless, despite multiple men having had ongoing access to the mother, and fatherless infants were vulnerable to exposure with no legal questions asked. Saga references to legal. Cases involving such situations treat them as property disputes rather than addressing the violence at their core. One legal case mentioned in secondary sources discusses a frillur's child being deemed eligible for exposure, because 3 men in the household had all had regular access to her, and therefore no single man could be proven responsible. The child's death was legally permissible precisely because of the systematic exploitation that had created paternity ambiguity. The deliberate obscuring of accountability became justification for infanticide, and the law saw nothing problematic in this logic. The psychological torment for the woman involved is difficult to articulate. You're exploited by multiple men, your body treated as communal property. You become pregnant. Which man's child you're carrying is unknowable even to you, and you understand, as your pregnancy progresses, that this very uncertainty dooms your child. No one will claim responsibility. No one will acknowledge paternity. Your infant will be deemed fatherless, and will almost certainly be exposed. The exploitation that impregnated you becomes the justification for killing your child, and the system sees this as perfectly logical. This reminds us that systems are often deliberately designed to obscure accountability, and that confusion about responsibility is frequently an excuse to deny all responsibility. When harm is diffused across multiple actors, when no one person is clearly at fault, the result is often that victims receive no justice and no support. The frillur, whose children were deemed fatherless, despite multiple men's access, remind us that collective responsibility often becomes an excuse for collective abandonment, and that systems that obscure individual accountability serve those who benefit from avoiding consequences for their actions. Chapter 14. Christianity's Empty Promises. As Christianization spread through Scandinavia, from roughly the 10th century onward, one might imagine that religious reform would have improved conditions for frillur. After all, Christian teaching opposed concubinage, emphasized marriage as a sacrament, and preached the equal value of souls before God. For women suffering in sexual bondage, the arrival of this new religion might have seemed to promise liberation, or at least protection. But the reality proved bitterly disappointing. Christianity's theoretical opposition to concubinage translated into little practical improvement for most frillur, and institutional reforms changed terminology and paperwork while leaving actual live conditions largely unchanged. The early Christian missionaries and bishops certainly preached against concubinage. Church councils condemned the practice. Priests were instructed to refuse sacraments to men who kept concubines. On paper, the Church's position seemed clear. Marriage was the only legitimate context for sexual relations, and concubinage was sinful. But enforcement of these teachings proved extraordinarily weak, especially when the men involved were powerful. Kings, jarls, and wealthy landowners who kept multiple women were not about to abandon profitable arrangements because of a priest's objections, and priests who valued their relationships with local power holders learned not to press too hard. Picture a frillur living through this period of religious transition. Perhaps you've heard the Christian teachings that all souls are equal before God, that your suffering matters to the divine, that the man exploiting you is committing sin. Perhaps you've even converted yourself, hoping that claiming Christian identity might afford you some protection, might make someone in authority care about your bondage. You attend services when permitted, you pray fervently for intervention, you wait for the church's teachings about the sanctity of marriage and the sinfulness of sexual exploitation to translate into actual help. But nothing changes. The man who keeps you is baptized, makes public shows of piety, perhaps even donates land to the church, and continues to exploit you exactly as before. The darkest aspect of Christianization for frillur was that it often simply resulted in reclassification without liberation. Men who were pressured to give up their concubines frequently just reclassified these women as servants, or thralls, while maintaining the same sexual access and same exploitative arrangements. The legal terminology changed. Women were no longer formally called frillur, but the lived reality of sexual bondage continued unchanged. Some evidence suggests women's legal status actually worsened through this transition. Where frillur had occupied an ambiguous middle ground, with theoretical possibility of elevation through bearing acknowledged children, reclassification as thralls removed even that slim hope, placing women firmly in the category of chattel slavery. Evidence from multiple sources indicates that clergy themselves sometimes participated in the system they were supposedly reforming. Adam of Bremen's 11th century chronicles mention Scandinavian Christians, including some in clerical positions, who maintained concubines in the old way, despite baptism and church teaching. Some church estates held enslaved women whose status and treatment likely differed little from frillur. Priests who depended on wealthy patron support were in no position to alienate those patrons by demanding real reform of sexual exploitation patterns. Institutional survival took precedence over protecting vulnerable women. For women who had converted hoping for church protection, this reality must have been devastating. The promises of spiritual equality and divine concern for suffering proved hollow when confronted with earthly power structures. No priest intervened to stop their exploitation. No church authority demanded their freedom. The liturgy spoke of redemption and dignity, but daily life continued its familiar brutality. Religion provided perhaps some internal comfort, a belief that suffering witnessed by God might have meaning, that ultimate justice awaited in afterlife. But it offered no material improvement to their circumstances. The hope Christianity initially seemed to offer proved as illusory as every other promise made to women without power. This reminds us that institutional reforms are often performative, changing language and formal structures while leaving actual practices intact. We might consider how frequently legal or religious prohibitions against exploitation coexist with ongoing exploitation. The rules serving primarily to make the system appear more humane without actually protecting victims. The frillur who converted to Christianity hoping for liberation learned what many have learned since, that proclaimed values and lived realities often diverge dramatically, and that institutions prioritize their own survival and relationships with power over protecting the vulnerable. Chapter 15. Living in Permanent Terror. We've discussed the physical violence, the sexual exploitation, the reproductive coercion, the legal invisibility. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the frillur's existence was psychological. The sustained, comprehensive assault on mind and spirit that came from living in a state of permanent terror and absolute powerlessness. This was not trauma from a single horrific event that one might potentially process and recover from. This was ongoing, cumulative trauma, day after day, year after year, with no expectation of relief, no hope of escape, no framework for understanding one's suffering as anything other than deserved or inevitable. The psychological profile of sustained captivity and exploitation shares features across historical periods and cultures. Victims develop hypervigilance, a constant state of alertness to potential danger, scanning environments for threats, never able to fully relax. They lose any sense of safety or control, understanding that violence can come at any moment for any reason, or no reason at all. They may develop what we now call learned helplessness, a psychological state where the absence of any effective response to violence leads to passive acceptance even when opportunities for resistance might exist. And they often experience dissociation, a psychological splitting where the mind protects itself by separating from the body during trauma, creating a sense of watching events happen to someone else. Let us imagine waking each morning in such a state. Before you even open your eyes, anxiety floods your body. What will today bring? Will the household head's mood be violent or merely indifferent? Will the wife find some excuse to punish you? Will there be enough food, or will you go to sleep hungry again? As you move through daily tasks, part of your mind is always calculating. Where are the household members? What moods do they seem to be in? Which spaces are safe right now? Which should be avoided? You never make direct eye contact. That could be interpreted as insolence. You never move too quickly. That could startle someone into striking you. You never move too slowly. That's laziness deserving punishment. Every action is calibrated. Every moment requires vigilance. The absence of any predictability compounded the psychological damage. Victims of sustained abuse often cope better when they can predict patterns. If I do X, Y happens, because prediction allows for some sense of control. But in systems where violence is arbitrary, where even perfect compliance offers no protection, the mind has no stable ground. You might be beaten today for something that was ignored yesterday. An action that pleased the household head last week might enrage him this week. The wife who seemed neutral last month might suddenly decide you deserve torture for no reason you can discern. There's no algorithm for safety, no way to guarantee survival through good behaviour. You live in chaos, and chaos is psychologically annihilating. What made this situation even more devastating was the complete absence of trauma support, or even acknowledgement that trauma existed. In modern contexts, we understand that violence causes psychological injury requiring care and recovery. But Viking Age Scandinavia had no such framework. A frillur's suffering was not recognised as legitimate. She was property. Property doesn't experience trauma. Property's distress is irrelevant except as it affects utility. If exploitation made you withdrawn or unresponsive, you were lazy. If it made you weep constantly, you were weak. If it made you angry, you were dangerous. The psychological injury from sustained violence was interpreted as character flaw, earning additional punishment rather than compassion. Evidence suggests that some women responded to this impossible situation through self-harm or suicide. Saga references to women who threw themselves from cliffs, or drowned in the well, or went mad, might represent cases where psychological trauma became so unbearable that death seemed the only available form of control. Some women might have deliberately provoked fatal punishments as their only accessible means of ending suffering. These deaths were recorded, when recorded at all, as accidents or madness, never as the logical outcomes of systematic psychological torture. The saga that mentions a woman who jumped from a cliff offers no explanation, no context, no curiosity about what might have driven her to that final act. Her death merits only a passing mention, unremarkable as the weather. So the next time we encounter historical records that seem to show passive acceptance of exploitation, we might consider what psychological states underlie apparent passivity. We might remember that trauma compounds when suffering is unacknowledged, and that the absence of support or recognition for psychological injury can be as devastating as the original violence. The frillur, who endured decades in permanent terror, remind us that the mind can be as thoroughly destroyed as the body, and that psychological violence leaves scars as real as any physical wound, even when those scars remain invisible to observers who choose not to see. Chapter 16. Death without burial. Unmarked. Graves. Death comes to everyone eventually, but in Viking Age society, how one was buried revealed everything about one's status in life. High-status individuals received elaborate ship burials or chamber graves filled with valuable goods. Weapons, jewellery, fine clothing, sometimes even sacrificed animals or human attendants to accompany them into the afterlife. Free persons of modest means received simpler graves, but still with proper orientation, basic grave goods, and location within recognised burial grounds. And then there were the burials, if we can even call them that, of the lowest status women, including likely frillur, bodies disposed of in field edges, property boundaries, refuse heaps, sometimes without even the dignity of proper grave orientation or individual burial plots. The archaeological evidence for these degraded burials appears across Viking Age Scandinavia. Excavations repeatedly find human remains in marginal locations, the edges of proper cemeteries, corners of fields, areas used for trash disposal. These burials typically lack grave goods entirely, or contain only the most minimal items. The bodies are often oriented differently from normal burials, sometimes placed face down or in unusual positions that suggest contempt rather than respect. Some appear to have been buried in refuse pits alongside animal bones and broken pottery, the human remains treated as waste to be disposed of rather than as honoured dead requiring proper ritual. Let us now consider what such burial practices reveal about how these women were viewed even in death. A proper burial in Viking Age belief was essential for the dead person's journey to the afterlife. The grave goods provided resources for that journey. The ritual acknowledged the person's membership in the community and family. To be buried without these elements was to be denied not just earthly dignity, but spiritual continuity. A woman disposed of in a midden heap was being told, even in death, that she was garbage, that her entire existence, including whatever came after, was worthless. The household that had exploited her labour and body for years or decades couldn't be bothered with even minimal burial ritual once she ceased to be useful. One particularly stark example comes from excavations at Flakstad in northern Norway. Archaeologists discovered a woman's skeleton buried face down with a large stone placed on her back. This burial orientation and the stone placement are interpreted as deliberate humiliation, a burial of contempt reserved for criminals, outcasts, or reviled individuals. The woman's skeletal analysis suggested she was between 25 and 35 years old at death, showed evidence of hard physical labour, and had experienced significant nutritional deficiency during her life. Her burial location was marginal, away from the main cemetery. Every element of her interment communicated, "You were despised in life. You are despised in death. Even the earth should reject you." The darkest aspect of these disposal practices was that some women appear to have received no burial at all. Historical sources occasionally mention bodies being left for scavengers or burned on refuse heaps, and while archaeological evidence for this is necessarily sparse, bodies that weren't buried don't leave discoverable remains, the casual mention of such practices in texts suggests they occurred with some regularity. A frillur who died might be dragged to the edge of the property and left for animals to scatter, her bones eventually lost to time and weather. No ritual, no grave marker, no memory. She lived without legal existence and died without acknowledgement that she had ever existed at all. For women who had endured decades of exploitation, this final indignity must have cast a shadow over even their moments of life. You knew, as you worked and suffered, that no one would mourn your death. You knew your body would be disposed of without ceremony. You knew that within a generation, perhaps within years, no one would remember your name, your face, or anything about your existence except perhaps as a vague unit in household labour calculations, the complete erasure awaited you, beginning the moment your utility ended and continuing forever after. This reminds us that societies express their devaluation of certain lives through how they treat death. Who gets mourned? Who gets remembered? Who gets proper burial with ritual and respect? These choices reveal what and whom a culture values. The women buried face down in middens, disposed of like refuse, denied even the basic dignity of proper interment, were being told by their societies that their lives had meant nothing, and the absence of their voices in historical record, no names, no stories, only occasional skeletal remains to testify they existed, represents perhaps the final violence, not just to kill or exploit, but to erase so thoroughly that future generations might never know the suffering occurred at all. Chapter 17. The Silence of Sources. We've been reconstructing the lives of frillur from fragments, from legal codes, from saga references, from archaeological evidence, from the negative space where their voices should be, but aren't. This reconstruction is necessary because we have almost no first-hand accounts from concubines themselves. They left no written records of their experiences, no letters describing their suffering, no memoirs for future generations. This silence is not accidental. It reflects how thoroughly these women were excluded not just from legal personhood and physical autonomy, but from the very mechanisms of historical memory. Their erasure from the record is itself evidence of how completely they were dehumanized. Literacy in Viking Age Scandinavia was limited and elite. Runes served primarily for memorial inscriptions, ownership marks, and brief messages rather than extensive narrative. The sagas that provide our richest sources for the period were written down centuries after the Viking Age, composed by Christian clerics or educated lay people, and they reflect the perspectives and interests of male elites. Women appear in sagas, sometimes prominently but almost exclusively women of high status. Queens, wealthy widows, wives of important men. Lower status women appear primarily as plot devices or background characters, and frillur, they're nearly invisible, mentioned in passing if at all, their experiences deemed unworthy of narrative attention. Picture the infrastructure of memory in medieval Scandinavia. A wealthy man's deeds might be commemorated in runestones erected by his descendants, in oral poetry recited at feasts, eventually in written sagas. A high-status woman might appear in family genealogies, might have her marriage or death recorded, might even become a saga character if her life intersected with male power struggles in interesting ways. But a frillur? Who would commemorate her? She had no descendants with resources or incentive to remember her. Her children, if they survived, were marked by her status and had every reason to distance themselves from her memory. The household that exploited her had no interest in recording her existence beyond basic inventory needs. She appears in no genealogy, inspires no poetry, earns no runestone. What makes this historical silence truly disturbing is that the absence itself tells us something crucial. When a society systematically excludes certain categories of people from the mechanisms of historical record-keeping, that exclusion reflects how thoroughly those people were dehumanized. Frillur couldn't leave written accounts because they were denied literacy. They don't appear in sagas because saga authors didn't consider their experiences worthy of narrative attention. They lack memorial stones because they were deemed unworthy of commemoration. The very absence is evidence that they were viewed as less than fully human, as beings whose suffering and death were so unremarkable that they required no documentation. We reconstruct their lives now from inference and fragments. Legal codes tell us what could be done to frillur, which allows us to infer what probably was done. Archaeological evidence, skeletal trauma, burial patterns, residential remains, provides physical testimony that written sources omit. Occasional saga moments where frillur speak or act, even in fiction written by men who are not trying to accurately represent their experiences, sometimes reveal recognisable humanity breaking through the narrative constraints. And the gaps themselves, the places where frillur should appear in records but don't, tell us about systematic erasure. Consider Melkorka in Laxdæla saga, one of the few frillur who appears as something more than background. She's an Irish princess captured and sold into concubinage, and the saga presents her as maintaining silence about her origin for years, pretending to be mute. When she finally speaks, revealing her true status to her son, the saga treats this as a dramatic moment of identity revelation. But even in this fictional account, more generous than most to a concubine character, Melkorka's perspective during her years of sexual exploitation is absent. The saga tells us what happened to her, but never lets us inside her experience of those events. Even in fiction, even in a saga that treats her somewhat sympathetically, her interiority remains inaccessible. This reminds us that historical silence about certain groups' suffering is not neutral. It's not simply that some stories happened not to be recorded. Rather, systematic exclusion from historical record reflects deliberate devaluation. When we encounter histories that focus exclusively on male elites, on warfare and politics and property transfer, we should ask, whose experiences are missing, whose suffering goes unrecorded, whose lives were deemed so insignificant that their existence required no documentation? The silence surrounding frillur reminds us that recovering marginalised histories requires reading sources against their grain, attending to absences and gaps, and acknowledging that much of the past suffering occurred in spaces the powerful never bothered to document. Chapter 18. Male slaves and sexual violence. In our examination of sexual exploitation in Viking Age Scandinavia, we have focused primarily on women, and rightly so, as women constituted the vast majority of victims and the frillur system specifically targeted female bodies. But historical honesty requires acknowledging that enslaved men also faced sexual violence, though configured differently and buried under even deeper layers of silence and shame. The saga, literature and legal codes that occasionally mention frillur are almost completely silent about sexual violence against male thralls. This silence itself reveals something significant. Certain forms of exploitation were considered so shameful, so threatening to masculine identity and social order, that they could not be openly acknowledged even in cultures relatively frank about other forms of brutality. The vulnerability of enslaved men to sexual violence followed logically from their legal status. Like frillur, male thralls were property with no recognised bodily autonomy. They could not refuse their owners' demands or bring legal complaints about treatment. The same absolute power that enabled sexual exploitation of female slaves extended theoretically to male slaves as well. Yet while concubinage of women was openly practiced and legally regulated, sexual violence against men existed in a realm of deep taboo. The sagas that casually mention men taking female slaves contain no equivalent references to male slaves being sexually exploited, though logic and comparative evidence from other slave societies suggest it occurred. Let us turn to what little evidence exists. Some legal codes contain cryptic references to male slaves who resist certain unspecified demands from owners or household members, with penalties specified for such resistance. The vagueness of these legal texts, their refusal to name what's being discussed, suggests subjects considered too shameful for explicit statement. Archaeological evidence provides somewhat more direct testimony. Some male skeletal remains from probable slave burials show evidence of violent genital trauma. These injuries occurred during life, healed sufficiently to leave bone markers, and could not have resulted from ordinary accidents. They represent deliberate violence to male sexual organs, violence that the victim survived to endure for years afterward. The practice of castration appears in some regions and periods of Viking Age activity, particularly in areas of contact with Byzantine or Islamic cultures, where eunuchs served specific social functions. Whether Scandinavians themselves practiced castration as punishment, control, or for creating specific categories of enslaved servants is debated, but references in sources describing Scandinavian slave traders suggest awareness of the practice and possible participation in it. A castrated male slave served certain functions. He could be trusted in proximity to women he could not impregnate. He might be sold for premium prices in markets where eunuchs were valued. But the practice also represented the ultimate assertion of power through sexual mutilation. What makes this aspect of Viking Age slavery so difficult to study is the near-complete absence of testimony. We have no accounts, even filtered through saga literature, of male slaves' experiences of sexual violence. The shame attached to male victimization in cultures that equated masculinity with dominance and penetrative sexual power meant that such experiences could not be acknowledged without devastating loss of status, and enslaved men already occupied the lowest possible status. The result was silence layered upon silence. Victims who could not speak about their experiences while alive, no cultural mechanism for recording those experiences after death, and modern scholars often uncomfortable addressing the topic's existence. The complete silence speaks to something profound about how certain forms of violence are rendered invisible, not through lack of occurrence, but through collective refusal to acknowledge them. Male sexual victimization challenged fundamental assumptions about masculine hierarchy and power. Admitting it happened to enslaved men might have forced uncomfortable questions about vulnerability that free men preferred not to contemplate. So the violence occurred in shadows, in spaces so deeply hidden that even centuries later we can barely reconstruct what happened, and victims carried their trauma in absolute isolation with no possibility of acknowledgement or witness. This reminds us that certain types of suffering remain deeply taboo across historical periods, and that shame can silence victims and observers alike. When we study historical injustice, we must attend not just to what sources say, but to what they refuse to say, to the silences that reveal subjects considered too threatening or shameful to acknowledge. The male slaves whose sexual victimization appears only in cryptic legal language and skeletal trauma markers remind us that some violence is erased so thoroughly that recovering it requires reading the absence itself as evidence. Chapter 19. Concubinage. Across cultures. Before we proceed further, we should acknowledge a crucial context. The concubinage and sexual slavery we've been examining were not uniquely Viking phenomena. Comparable systems existed across medieval Europe and far beyond, in Anglo-Saxon England, in medieval Ireland and Scotland, in Byzantium, in Islamic societies, in civilizations across Asia and Africa. The specific legal terminology and household structures varied, but the fundamental reality of institutionalized sexual exploitation of lower status women appeared with depressing consistency across wildly different cultures and time periods. Understanding this pattern helps us see Viking Age concubinage not as a cultural aberration, but as one local manifestation of a nearly universal historical phenomenon, the exploitation of vulnerable women by men with power. In Anglo-Saxon England, a comparable system distinguished between legal wives and women called friotho wife, literally free servant wives, women who served as long-term sexual partners without the full legal status of wives. Like Scandinavian frillur, these women occupied an ambiguous legal position, and their children faced reduced inheritance rights and social stigma. In medieval Ireland, legal codes recognised ketmuinta, or second wives, women who lived in household relationships with married men but lacked the primary wife's legal protections and status. The terminology differed, but the lived experience, sexual availability without consent, children without full legitimacy, bondage without recourse, remained remarkably similar. Picture for a moment the medieval Mediterranean world. In Byzantine society, wealthy men maintained various categories of women in their households: slaves, concubines, servants with unclear status, and these women faced sexual exploitation backed by law and custom. In Islamic societies, slavery and concubinage were legally regulated, with specific rules about what rights enslaved women possessed, limited, and what obligations owners bore, also limited. The specific legal frameworks differed from Scandinavian practice, but the underlying structure remained. Powerful men claiming sexual access to lower status women, children born without full legitimacy, legal systems that recognise such arrangements as permissible if regulated. What makes these cross-cultural comparisons important is that they reveal patterns transcending any single culture's specific beliefs or practices. The Vikings were not uniquely brutal in this regard. Christian societies that theoretically opposed concubinage often practiced it under different terminology. Islamic legal systems that provided some protections for concubines still fundamentally treated them as property. Byzantine Christianity's opposition to slavery coexisted with flourishing slave markets. Across all these cultures, when economic systems made it profitable to treat women as property, and when legal systems failed to protect vulnerable women, sexual exploitation followed with depressing predictability. The Viking system was perhaps more legally explicit than some others about concubines' lack of rights. Scandinavian law codes spelled out precisely what frillur could not do in unusually direct language. But this explicitness should not be mistaken for unique brutality. Other cultures achieved similar outcomes through different mechanisms. Anglo-Saxon England through vague legal categories, medieval Ireland through complex marriage hierarchies, Byzantine society through combinations of slavery and informal household arrangements. The lived experience of sexual exploitation without recourse remained remarkably consistent even when the legal frameworks differed. This contextualization is not meant to excuse Viking Age practices by spreading blame across cultures. Rather, it's meant to help us understand that we're examining a human rights issue that requires eternal vigilance, not merely a historical curiosity about one culture's specific customs. When women lack legal protections, when economic systems make exploitation profitable, when powerful men face no consequences for sexual violence, these conditions produce remarkably similar outcomes across vast differences in religion, geography and time period. The frillur system was not an aberration, but a local instance of a pattern that appears wherever and whenever conditions permit it. So the next time we encounter romanticized narratives about any historical period, whether Vikings, medieval knights, ancient empires or other eras often portrayed heroically, we might ask, whose experiences are being omitted from these narratives? Whose suffering is being minimized or ignored? And we might recognise that sexual exploitation of vulnerable women is not a problem solved by historical progress, but an ongoing human rights issue requiring constant attention, because the underlying dynamics of power and vulnerability that enable past exploitation have not disappeared but merely take different forms in different eras. Chapter 20. The Economics of Bodies. Throughout our examination of Viking Age concubinage, one question perhaps looms. Why did this system persist? Why did it endure for centuries, surviving Christianization and legal reforms, reappearing in new forms even when old terminology changed? The answer lies in brutal economic logic. The system persisted because it was profitable. Treating women as property that could produce both labour and more property through forced reproduction made cold economic sense to those with the power to implement such a system. When humans can be owned, and when ownership is economically advantageous to those making and enforcing the rules, justice becomes irrelevant to those rules' continuation. The economic advantages of keeping frillur were multiple and overlapping. A concubine cost less to acquire and maintain than a wife. A wife required a bride price payment to her family, brought rights to dower and inheritance, and her family connections created obligations and potential interference. A frillur required none of this. She might be purchased cheaply at slave markets, captured during raids for no cost beyond the expedition itself, or acquired through debt transactions. she could be maintained on minimal food and resources, and if she became inconvenient, she could be sold, given away, or disposed of with no legal complications. But the real economic advantage came from reproduction. A frillur's children, if acknowledged by their father, increased household wealth, more hands for labour, more bodies to deploy in economic activities or trade as needed. If not acknowledged, they could be exposed at no cost beyond the woman's lost labour time during pregnancy. This created an incentive structure where keeping multiple frillur pregnant maximised the household's population growth and labour force, without the legal complications and inheritance obligations that came with legitimate children from wives. Some wealthy men maintained multiple frillur specifically as breeding operations. Women kept pregnant repeatedly to maximise production of children, who could be put to work or sold. Let us imagine the accounting from a household head's perspective, stripped of any moral consideration. A frillur purchased at age 15 for the price of a few livestock can produce 20 to 25 years of labour before her productivity declines significantly. During that time, she might bear 6 to 8 children. If even half survive to working age, and if some are acknowledged and kept rather than sold, the household gains multiple new workers at minimal investment beyond basic food and shelter. The children grow to be adults who themselves work or can be traded. The household's labour capacity and wealth increase significantly, all from the initial investment of one woman's purchase price. Estate inventories that survive from the period occasionally list enslaved and semi-enslaved women by their reproductive history. 3 children born, 2 surviving, or similar notations. These women were assessed like breeding livestock, their value calculated based on their remaining fertile years and proven capacity to bear children. The children themselves might be counted separately in inventories if they'd been acknowledged, or they might not be mentioned at all if they'd been exposed or sold away. The cold calculation of human reproductive capacity as economic resource appears in these documents with no apparent discomfort or ethical concern. What made this economic system particularly resistant to reform was that it benefited precisely those with the power to change it. Wealthy men, the ones who wrote laws and controlled resources, profited from the concubinage system. They had no incentive to abolish a practice that increased their wealth and labour force while imposing costs and suffering on people without power to resist. When Christianity introduced theoretical opposition to concubinage, the practical effect was minimal precisely because economic incentives outweighed religious teaching. Men found ways to maintain the substance of exploitative arrangements, while adjusting terminology to satisfy religious authorities who were themselves often dependent on these same powerful men's patronage. The system's economic logic also explains why it reappeared in new forms even after formal abolition. When concubinage was officially ended in Christianized Scandinavia, many women were simply reclassified as thralls, full slaves rather than the ambiguous frillur category, and exploitation continued under different legal terminology. The economic advantages of owning women's bodies and reproductive capacity didn't disappear when the specific category frillur was abolished, so new categories emerged to serve the same functions. As long as the underlying economic incentives remained, and as long as those with power to change the system were also those benefiting from it, reform remained largely cosmetic. This reminds us that economic systems can make cruelty profitable, and that when they do, moral arguments alone rarely succeed in creating change. We might consider how contemporary systems continue to make exploitation profitable in different forms, how poverty wages, how lack of healthcare, how inadequate legal protections for vulnerable workers create conditions where people are exploited because exploitation is economically advantageous to those with power. The frillur, whose bodies were calculated as economic resources, remind us that treating humans as property takes many forms across time, and that challenging such treatment requires not just moral argument but structural change that removes profit from exploitation. Chapter 21. Small Acts of Defiance. In the face of overwhelming power and constant surveillance, open rebellion was suicide. A frillur who physically attacked her exploiter would be killed immediately. A woman who refused orders explicitly faced brutal punishment. Yet human beings do not become completely passive even under the most comprehensive systems of control. Where open resistance means death, resistance goes underground, becomes subtle, deniable, small enough to evade certain punishment but large enough to preserve some sense of agency. Evidence suggests that some frillur engaged in covert resistance, deliberate work, slowdowns, strategic incompetence, subtle sabotage of household operations, and the careful spreading of information that might undermine those in power. These acts of resistance were necessarily invisible and deniable. A woman who was too clumsy to complete certain tasks correctly might be genuinely lacking skill, or she might be deliberately failing as the only form of control available to her. Food that spoiled or was ruined during preparation might be accident or sabotage. Information about household vulnerabilities that somehow reached enemies or rivals might have leaked accidentally or been deliberately whispered. The beauty of these tactics was their ambiguity. They could be attributed to incompetence or misfortune rather than defiance, giving the resistant woman a thin layer of protection. Picture a frillur working in the kitchen, preparing food for a feast. She knows which herbs are medicinal and which cause illness. She knows how to preserve food properly and therefore knows how to allow it to spoil. She knows what temperature keeps meat safe and what temperature allows dangerous growth. She has intimate knowledge of the household's food systems and could, if she chose, deploy that knowledge to make people sick, not obviously poisoned, just persistently unwell from food that's slightly off, from dishes prepared in ways that maximize digestive distress. This knowledge is power, and using it carries enormous risk, but it's one of the few forms of power available to her. The darkest aspect of even these small resistances was the danger they carried. A woman suspected of deliberate sabotage faced torture and death. Even if she maintained that failures were accidental, persistent accidents might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural malice or deliberate incompetence deserving severe punishment. Some women caught in acts that could be interpreted as resistance were beaten so severely they became permanently disabled. Others were killed outright. The courage required for even minor defiance under such circumstances is staggering. These women risked death for the sake of small symbolic victories, for the psychological necessity of maintaining some sense of their own agency. Saga literature occasionally preserves hints of this covert resistance, though always filtered through the perspectives of those in power. One saga mentions a servant woman who could never learn to complete certain tasks properly despite repeated beatings. The saga presents this as evidence of stupidity or stubbornness, but we might read it differently, as evidence of a woman who chose continued beatings over compliance, who preserved her sense of self through strategic incompetence. Another saga reference describes household disruptions, objects mysteriously breaking, food spoiling, accidents that seem to follow a particular servant that the household eventually attributed to supernatural causes and for which the woman was killed as a witch. But perhaps she was simply a resistant captive who had learned to create plausible deniability for small acts of sabotage. The spreading of information was another form of covert resistance. Frillur and other low-status household members heard everything. Conversations masters thought were private, discussions of strategy and vulnerability, revelations of illegal activities or shameful secrets. A woman with nothing to lose might find ways to ensure that damaging information reached competitors or enemies. She might accidentally be overheard discussing household secrets in places where the wrong people could hear. She might deliberately fail to secure doors or warn about intruders when she should have. These acts of strategic negligence or deliberate intelligence sharing could harm those in power while maintaining some deniability about intentionality. We cannot know how common such resistance actually was. By its nature, successful covert resistance left no clear record, and failures were interpreted through frameworks that denied women's agency. But the very fact that some women chose beatings over complete compliance, that some maintained areas of deliberate incompetence despite punishment, that some found ways to exercise tiny amounts of control over their circumstances, this tells us something essential about human resilience. Even in systems designed to crush all resistance, people find ways to resist. Even when the cost of defiance is enormous, some people choose defiance because the alternative, complete psychological surrender, is worse than death. This reminds us that resistance takes forms that dominant narratives often don't recognise or record. When we encounter historical accounts that present exploited people as passive or accepting, we might ask, what forms of resistance would we fail to see if we took these accounts at face value? How does covert resistance operate when open rebellion is impossible? And we might recognise that maintaining any sense of agency under conditions of comprehensive control is itself an act of extraordinary courage, even when that agency manifests only in small deniable acts that historical records rarely acknowledge. Chapter 22. Conversion to Thraldom. The formal end of the frillur system in Christianized Scandinavia might seem like progress, a step toward ending sexual exploitation. But the reality proved bitterly ironic. When Christian pressure forced the nominal abolition of concubinage, many households simply reclassified their frillur as thralls, full slaves rather than the ambiguous category of concubines. This administrative change satisfied religious authorities who could claim victory over sinful concubinage, but for the women themselves, reclassification often made their situations worse rather than better. They moved from a legal grey zone with at least theoretical possibilities for status improvement to unambiguous chattel slavery with no such possibilities. The frillur system, for all its brutality, had occupied a unique legal space. A frillur was not technically a slave who could be freely bought and sold at public markets, with iron collar and posted prices. She existed in an ambiguous zone that sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes, allowed for elevation. If she bore a son whom the father particularly favoured, if she proved especially valuable to the household, if circumstances aligned favourably, a frillur might be formally married to her keeper, transforming her children from illegitimate to legitimate and securing her own status. This outcome was rare enough to be exceptional, but common enough to appear in saga literature as a recognised possibility. It was a slim hope, but it was something. Let us turn to what reclassification to thraldom meant for that slim hope. A thrall was unambiguously enslaved property, fully subject to sale, trade and exploitation, with no theoretical path to elevation through relationship. Thralls could be manumitted, freed, but manumission was entirely at the owner's discretion, often cost money the enslaved person had no way to earn, and carried no guarantee. Some legal codes made thraldom explicitly heritable. The children of thralls were thralls, generation after generation, with no mechanism for status improvement. So a woman reclassified from frillur to thrall during Christianization moved from ambiguous exploitation with theoretical escape routes to explicit slavery with no legal exit. Evidence from the transition period suggests many women experienced precisely this trajectory. Church pressure forced wealthy men to abandon the language and formal category of concubinage, but the underlying exploitation continued. The women who had been frillur were reclassified in estate records and legal documents. Same women, same households, same treatment, different terminology. Some documents survive showing women listed as frillur in earlier entries, but thrall in later entries for the identical household, suggesting administrative relabeling rather than any change in actual circumstances. What made this transition particularly cruel was how it was presented as moral progress. Religious authorities celebrated the end of concubinage as a Christian victory over pagan sexual immorality. bishops and clerics pointed to the reclassification as evidence that their teaching was transforming society. But for the women experiencing this reform, nothing improved and some things worsened. They were still sexually exploited with no recourse. They still bore children they could not protect. They still performed forced labour in conditions of bondage. But now they also lost even the slim possibility that favourable circumstances might allow elevation, and they occupied any unambiguous legal category that made their complete powerlessness even more explicit. The pattern reveals something important about how systems maintain exploitation while appearing to reform. When external pressure demands change, those benefiting from unjust systems often respond with cosmetic adjustments that preserve substance while altering appearance. The terminology changes, the administrative categories shift, maybe some new regulations are written, and authorities celebrating these changes declare victory. But the lived experiences of those being exploited continue largely unchanged, because the underlying power dynamics and economic incentives remain intact. The frillur becomes a thrall, the concubine becomes a servant, the exploited woman continues suffering under a new label that satisfies reformers without actually protecting her. So the next time we encounter historical narratives about religious or legal reforms that claim to improve conditions for vulnerable people, we might ask, what actually changed for those people, as opposed to what changed in terminology or formal categories? Did the reform alter power relationships and material conditions, or did it merely rebrand exploitation to satisfy external critics while maintaining the substance of abuse? The women reclassified from frillur to thralls during Christianization remind us that apparent progress can mask continued or even worsened oppression, and that evaluating reform requires looking at lived outcomes rather than accepting changed language as evidence of genuine improvement. Chapter 23. Archaeological Evidence. We have relied throughout this examination on multiple types of evidence: legal codes, saga literature, comparative cultural analysis, but perhaps the most direct testimony comes from the bones themselves. Physical anthropology and archaeological analysis of Viking Age skeletal remains provide evidence that cannot be dismissed as literary exaggeration or legal abstraction. Bones record violence, malnutrition, disease and trauma with unflinching accuracy. When we examine the skeletal remains of lower status women from this period, we see written in bone the reality of lives lived under sustained exploitation and violence. The markers of hard labour appear consistently in these skeletal remains. Women's bones show changes to joint surfaces consistent with repetitive heavy lifting, carrying and bending. Spinal compression and deformity suggest years of hauling water, grinding grain, and other physically demanding tasks performed from young ages. Hand and wrist bones show enlargement and stress markers from repeated gripping and manipulative work. These are the skeletal signatures of bodies used as tools, worn down by labour that began in childhood and continued without adequate rest or recovery time throughout life. Evidence of repeated childbirth appears in pelvic bones, distinctive scarring and changes that indicate multiple pregnancies and vaginal births. When combined with other skeletal markers, we can sometimes estimate how many times a woman gave birth. Some lower status women's remains show evidence of 5, 6, 8 childbirths, with each pregnancy and birth leaving permanent marks in bone. Combined with evidence of malnutrition and violent trauma, these skeletal changes tell stories of women's bodies used for reproduction under conditions that offered no adequate support or recovery time. Picture the forensic anthropologist examining these remains centuries later. She measures bone density, finding evidence of chronic nutritional deficiency. This woman didn't get enough calcium, enough protein, enough basic nutrition for her bones to develop and maintain properly. She examines joint surfaces, finding arthritic changes that suggest the woman performed repetitive heavy labour from adolescence onward. She studies the pelvic bones, counting pregnancy markers, finding evidence of multiple childbirths. She examines the skull and long bones, finding healed fractures, This woman's arm was broken and healed, broken again, healed poorly. Her facial bones show asymmetry from an injury that healed without proper setting. The skeleton tells a story its owner could never write, a life of exploitation, violence, malnutrition, and forced reproduction that ended in an unmarked grave. The darkest evidence appears in the violence markers some skeletons display. Healed fractures are common, but the pattern of injuries reveals intentionality. Defensive fractures in forearms, the kind that occur when someone raises their arms to protect their face from blows. Multiple rib fractures in various stages of healing, evidence of repeated beatings over time, fractures to facial bones that healed with deformity, and in some cases, evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries that occurred at or near the time of death. Some female skeletons show blunt force trauma to skulls, suggesting death from head injuries. Others show injuries consistent with violent assault, including in some cases evidence of genital trauma visible in pelvic bones. One particularly devastating example from Norwegian excavations showed a young woman, approximately 20 to 28 years old at death, with evidence of severe pelvic inflammation suggesting chronic infection. She also had skeletal markers indicating multiple childbirths in rapid succession. Most significantly, she showed evidence of a fistula, a pathological opening between vaginal and rectal or bladder tissues, typically caused by traumatic childbirth or sustained injury. This condition would have left her perpetually leaking waste, in constant pain, socially isolated. She was buried without grave goods in a marginal location, her skeleton discovered centuries later bearing permanent witness to suffering her voice never recorded. These skeletal remains force us to confront the physical reality of exploitation in ways that written sources allow us to evade. Legal codes are abstract. Sagas are literary, but bones are concrete, undeniable evidence of individual human suffering. Each skeleton represents a real woman who experienced the violence and deprivation her bones record, who lived through the pain of poorly healed fractures, who endured the exhaustion of malnutrition and overwork, who survived trauma after trauma until finally her body failed entirely. The bones cannot tell us these women's names, but they can tell us their suffering was real, was severe, and was systematic. This reminds us that scientific evidence can recover silenced voices and make visible what powerful people wanted hidden. Physical anthropology gives the voiceless a form of testimony, not in words, but in the unquestionable record written in bone. So the next time we encounter skepticism about historical suffering, claims that perhaps things weren't that bad, or that sources exaggerate, we might remember the skeletal evidence. The bones don't exaggerate, don't have ideological agendas, don't soften reality for comfortable consumption. They simply testify, this happened, this hurt, this woman suffered, and her suffering left permanent marks that endure centuries after her death. Chapter 24. The Myth of Viking Gender Equality. In recent decades, popular culture has developed a fascination with the idea that Viking society was unusually egalitarian regarding gender. We encounter claims that Viking women enjoyed remarkable freedom and power, that shield maidens fought alongside men as equals, that Scandinavian culture respected women in ways other medieval societies did not. These narratives appear in television shows, novels, museum exhibitions, and even some academic popularizations. And while they contain tiny kernels of truth, some elite Viking Age women did wield significant power, they fundamentally misrepresent the reality for the vast majority of women. More harmfully, they erase the suffering of the most vulnerable women, including frillur, by suggesting that Viking society's gender dynamics were somehow enlightened or progressive. The evidence for supposed Viking gender equality typically draws from exceptional cases. Yes, some high-status women like Ord the Deep-Minded controlled significant property and exercised authority. Yes, legal codes granted some women inheritance rights under specific circumstances. Yes, Wealthy widows sometimes managed estates and held positions of local power, but these exceptional cases were precisely that. Exceptional. And they tell us nothing about the experiences of ordinary women, much less enslaved or semi-enslaved women. Using elite women's limited power to characterize Viking gender relations as egalitarian is like using contemporary female CEOs as evidence that modern society has achieved gender equality. It mistakes exceptional cases for typical experiences. Let us now consider what this romanticization erases. When we celebrate Viking culture as somehow progressive about gender, we disappear the frillur whose existence fundamentally contradicts that narrative. We cannot simultaneously claim that Viking society respected women and acknowledge that it legally permitted men to keep women as sexual property with no rights whatsoever. We cannot celebrate Viking gender equality while confronting the reality of women sold at slave markets, impregnated through rape, and discarded when their utility expired. The Viking feminist narrative requires erasing or minimizing the most vulnerable women's experiences, treating them as unfortunate exceptions rather than as central examples of how Viking society actually treated women without power. The Shield Maiden myth deserves particular scrutiny. Archaeological evidence for female warriors in Viking Age Scandinavia is extraordinarily thin. Perhaps one or two burials that might suggest warrior status, though even these interpretations are debated. The overwhelming evidence shows warfare as an almost exclusively male activity, and saga literature's rare mentions of female fighters are typically either supernatural figures or women adopting male roles in exceptional circumstances portrayed as anomalous rather than accepted. Yet popular culture has inflated these rare possible exceptions into a widespread phenomenon, suggesting Viking women routinely fought as warriors. This fantasy is appealing. Who doesn't enjoy stories of women defying gender limitations? But it's historically inaccurate, and it obscures the reality that most Viking Age women lived under severe patriarchal constraints. What made the gender dynamics of Viking society particularly brutal was precisely how power was distributed among women based on status. Elite women could indeed exercise significant authority over their households, over lower status people, including other women, over economic resources. But this power didn't undermine patriarchy. It reinforced it by giving some women investment in maintaining hierarchies that oppressed other women. The husfreyja, who brutalized her husband's frillur, was exercising gendered power, but that power existed within, and reinforced a system of male supremacy that subordinated all women to men while allowing some women to dominate others. This is not gender equality. It's hierarchical oppression, with women participating in the exploitation of more vulnerable women. The modern romanticization of Viking gender relations does active harm. It provides comforting narratives about progress. Even medieval Vikings were more enlightened than we thought, that obscure the systematic nature of historical gender oppression. It allows contemporary audiences to enjoy Viking-themed entertainment without confronting uncomfortable truths about sexual violence and exploitation. And most significantly, it erases real historical victims by treating their suffering as inconvenient complications in an otherwise appealing narrative. The frillur, whose lives we've been examining throughout this video, disappear entirely from Viking gender equality narratives because acknowledging them would destroy those narratives' core claims. So the next time we encounter popular culture celebrating Viking society's supposedly progressive attitudes toward women, we might ask, which women? Women of what status? And whose experiences are being erased to make this narrative work? We might remember that selective memory and romanticization of the past serve present-day agendas rather than historical truth. And we might insist that accurate history that includes the suffering of the most vulnerable, not just the accomplishments of the most powerful, matters more than comfortable narratives that allow us to feel good about the past without confronting its most disturbing realities. Chapter 25. trauma that outlasted the system. The formal concubinage system eventually ended in Scandinavia, abolished through a combination of Christian pressure, legal reforms, and changing economic conditions. But the effects of that system persisted long after its formal abolition, persisted in the stigma attached to descendants of frillur, in the cultural attitudes about male sexual entitlement that the system had normalised and reinforced, in the trauma passed through generations, and in the legal disabilities that mark certain family lines as inferior for centuries. The long shadow of institutionalised sexual exploitation extended far beyond the system's official end, shaping Scandinavian society in ways that remained visible for generations. The stigma against descendants of frillur continued with remarkable persistence. Medieval Icelandic records, compiled centuries after the Viking Age ended, still designated some families with notations indicating frillur ancestry. These designations carried real consequences: restrictions on marriage into certain families, barriers to holding particular offices or positions, social contempt that marked individuals before they spoke a word. The original exploitation had occurred generations earlier, but the taint persisted, transmitted through family lines like a genetic curse. Children born in the 13th century bore social disabilities because their great-great-grandmother had been a concubine 2 centuries earlier. The shame was deliberately perpetuated as a form of social control. Let us imagine being born into such a marked family line. You grow up knowing that somewhere in your ancestry lies a woman who was sexually exploited, and that her victimization has somehow become your shame. You're introduced to others and see their expressions shift when they learn your family name, recognizing the stigma. You're barred from certain marriages not because of anything you've done, but because your bloodline is considered tainted. You excel at some endeavour, but your achievement is always qualified, impressive for someone of your background, remarkable despite your ancestry. The original violence occurred before you were born, but you carry its consequences throughout your life, and you'll pass it to your children and grandchildren in turn. The cultural normalisation of male sexual entitlement, created by the concubinage system, also persisted beyond the system's formal end. For centuries, Viking Age men had learned that some women were sexually available without consent, that male desire justified exploitation, that women could be categorised into those deserving protection and those existing for male use. These attitudes didn't disappear when the category frillur was abolished. They transmuted into other forms, assumptions about which women could be violated with impunity, beliefs about male sexual prerogatives, ideas about different categories of women deserving different treatment. The specific institution ended, but the underlying ideology proved remarkably durable. Archaeological evidence and historical records suggest that the abolition of formal concubinage didn't immediately end sexual exploitation of vulnerable women. It simply shifted the mechanisms. Lower status women, servants, those without family protection, they continued to experience sexual violence from employers and powerful men, but now without even the ambiguous legal recognition that had existed for frillur. The violence became legally invisible, which in some ways made it worse because victims had even less recourse or acknowledgement. The formal system ended, but informal exploitation continued, sheltered by the attitudes and entitlements the formal system had normalised. The trauma itself passed through generations in ways we're only beginning to understand through modern research on intergenerational trauma. Women who survived the concubinage system carried psychological wounds that affected their parenting, their relationships, their ability to trust or feel safe. Their children absorbed that trauma through subtle cues and direct teachings about danger and powerlessness. Those children passed it to their children in turn, a transmission of fear, hypervigilance, damaged capacity for trust that moved through family lines for generations. The original violence occurred centuries ago, but its psychological effects rippled forward through time, touching descendants who never consciously knew the source of their inherited anxiety. Some family lines maintained oral traditions, Not celebrated histories, but whispered warnings passed from mothers to daughters. Stories about what could happen to women without protection, about the dangers of male power, about the necessity of vigilance and the impossibility of true safety. These weren't neutral history lessons, but trauma responses encoded in cultural memory, teaching girls to be afraid in ways that reflected their great-great-grandmother's actual experiences of violence. The abuse ended, but the terror it instilled continued, teaching each new generation that women's bodies were vulnerable, and that protection was contingent and unreliable. This reminds us that systems of exploitation leave lasting marks on cultures and families long after the specific institutions end. Trauma and stigma aren't simply individual experiences that conclude when the original violence stops. They're transmitted forward through time, affecting people born long after the original harm occurred. So the next time we encounter discussions about historical injustices and whether we should still care about events that happened centuries ago, we might remember that those events didn't simply end. Their effects persist through stigma, through normalized attitudes, through intergenerational trauma, through the deep cultural learning that comes from generations of exploitation. The frillur whose suffering we've examined throughout this video are long dead, but their legacy, both the trauma they carried and the descendants marked by their status, extended far beyond their individual lives, shaping Scandinavian culture for centuries and offering lessons about exploitation's long shadow that remain relevant today. And so, we've reached the end of our examination of Viking Age concubinage and sexual exploitation. Over the past 2.5 hours, we've explored 25 dimensions of the frillur's existence, from legal non-existence to acquisition through violence and desperation, from household hierarchies to sexual violence without recourse, from forced pregnancy to the agonizing wait to learn whether one's child would live or die. We've examined sexually transmitted infections that caused chronic agony, the trading of women between men like livestock, the cruelties of aging in bondage, and the inherited shame that marked children for generations. We've confronted the impossibility of escape and the brutal punishments for trying. We've discussed the psychological devastation of living in permanent terror, the public nature of some exploitation, and the deliberate erasure of paternity to avoid responsibility. We've seen how Christianization brought empty promises rather than real reform, and how women were often reclassified from frillur to thralls, making their bondage more explicit rather than ending it. We've examined the archaeological evidence written in bone, the healed fractures, the markers of malnutrition and hard labour, the evidence of repeated childbirth and violent death. We've discussed the silence of historical sources, acknowledging that most of what we know comes from inference and fragments, because these women's voices were systematically excluded from historical record. We've noted that male slaves also faced sexual violence, buried under even deeper silence. We've contextualised concubinage as a cross-cultural phenomenon, not unique to Vikings, but appearing wherever conditions permitted exploitation. And we've examined the economic logic that sustained the system, the small acts of resistance that required extraordinary courage, and the long shadow of trauma and stigma that persisted for generations. Perhaps most importantly, we've confronted the modern myth of Viking gender equality, recognising how popular narratives erase the suffering of the most vulnerable women in service of comfortable stories about enlightened medieval Scandinavians. The frillur existed. Their suffering was real, systematic and legally sanctioned, and understanding their experiences matters, both for historical accuracy and for recognising how systems of exploitation operate across time and culture. If you've stayed with me through this entire examination, thank you. Your willingness to confront difficult historical truths, to sit with discomfort rather than turning away, honours the memory of women whose suffering deserves acknowledgement even centuries after their deaths. I hope this has been educational, even as I recognise how grim and disturbing much of the material has been. But before we part, there's something more worth considering. Something about how we in the present relate to this past, and what obligations we might have to remember accurately rather than comfortably. When we examine Viking Age concubinage, it's tempting to treat it as safely historical, as something that happened long ago in a very different world, with no real connection to our contemporary reality. And yes, the specific institution of the frillur no longer exists in Scandinavia, or anywhere else in precisely that form. We've abolished the legal categories, changed the terminology, reformed the laws. Progress has occurred, and that matters. But if we look more carefully, we might notice uncomfortable parallels between the dynamics that enabled Viking Age exploitation and dynamics that persist in modified forms today. The fundamental conditions that enabled the frillur system haven't disappeared. They've transformed. Women still become vulnerable through economic desperation, through lack of legal protections, through systems that value them primarily for reproductive capacity and sexual availability. Human trafficking still occurs, with women and children sold into sexual exploitation. Domestic workers in many parts of the world still exist in conditions approximating bondage, with confiscated documents, inability to leave, and sexual vulnerability to employers. The specific legal frameworks have changed, but exploitation finds new forms wherever power imbalances exist and legal protections prove inadequate. The erasure of victims' voices continues as well. Contemporary survivors of trafficking, of domestic violence, of systematic exploitation often find their testimony doubted, minimised or ignored, just as frillur's suffering was deemed unworthy of historical documentation. We still have hierarchies that determine whose pain matters, whose stories get told, whose suffering deserves attention and resources. The specific categories have changed. We no longer use terms like thrall and frillur, but we still distinguish between victims deemed sympathetic and those deemed somehow complicit or unworthy of support. And the economic logic persists. Exploitation continues because it's profitable for those with power, and those with power make and enforce the rules. When domestic labour can be obtained cheaply by exploiting vulnerable migrants, when manufacturing can rely on workers in conditions approximating bondage, when sexual exploitation generates massive profits for traffickers, the economic incentives that sustained historical systems of bondage haven't disappeared. They've simply adapted to new contexts with new language. I raise these parallels not to diminish the specific historical reality we've been examining, but to suggest that understanding past exploitation might help us recognise and resist present exploitation. The frillur can't be saved. They lived and died centuries ago, but people being exploited today might yet be helped if we learn to recognise the patterns, to challenge the systems that enable exploitation, and to insist that all people deserve protections regardless of status or circumstance. So perhaps our examination of Viking Age concubinage isn't merely historical curiosity. Perhaps it's a reminder that the human capacity for cruelty, for treating other humans as property, for normalising exploitation, these haven't been abolished, only transformed. And perhaps remembering the frillur accurately means committing to resist exploitation wherever we encounter it, in whatever forms it currently takes. But there's one more thing worth considering before we close, something about the nature of historical memory itself, and why recovering erased voices matters beyond the immediate facts of what occurred. Thank you again for staying through this long, difficult examination. I recognise that 2.5 hours exploring systematic sexual exploitation and violence is not light entertainment. If you're still listening, you've demonstrated remarkable commitment to understanding historical truth, even when that truth is deeply uncomfortable. That commitment matters. It honours the women whose experiences we've examined. It resists the erasure that began in their lifetimes and continued for centuries after their deaths. If you found value in this deep dive into unglamorous historical reality, I hope you'll consider supporting the channel through subscription if you haven't already, through sharing the video with others who might appreciate this kind of thorough historical examination, or simply through the thumbs up that helps the algorithm understand that serious educational content has an audience. These long-form explorations of history's darker corners exist because people like you value accuracy over romanticization, complexity over comfortable simplification. I also want to acknowledge that for some listeners this content may have been personally difficult in ways beyond mere historical interest. If you're a survivor of sexual violence, of trafficking, of exploitation, thank you for trusting this examination to handle these subjects with appropriate seriousness. I hope I've succeeded in that, and if the content has been triggering or harmful, I apologise, and I hope you're able to access whatever support you need. For those using this video as a sleep aid, which is perfectly appropriate and which I hope the length and pacing support, I wish you genuine rest. May your sleep be deep and restorative, undisturbed by nightmares, and may you wake feeling refreshed rather than burdened by the dark history we've explored together. But before sleep comes, or before you return to whatever task brought you here, let me leave you with one final thought, a reflection on what it means to remember, to bear witness, to insist that suffering that occurred long ago still matters today. Picture, one last time, the landscape of Viking Age Scandinavia, the long northern twilights in summer when darkness barely comes at all, the brutal winters when daylight lasts only a few hours and survival depends on preparations made months earlier, the isolated farmsteads separated by forest and mountain, the small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, the harsh beauty of a landscape that inspired both poetry and pragmatic cruelty. Somewhere in that landscape, perhaps on a Norwegian farm overlooking a fjord, perhaps in an Icelandic valley, perhaps on a Danish estate, there lived women whose names we'll never know. Women who woke each morning not knowing whether that day would bring violence or merely grinding labour. Women who bore children they couldn't protect, who endured exploitation without recourse, who lived and died in bondage while the world around them treated their suffering as unremarkable as the weather. They existed. They mattered. And though their voices were silenced in their lifetimes and for centuries after, their experiences deserve to be remembered. These women's lives were not abstract historical data points. Each was a person with hopes that were crushed, with bonds that were severed, with suffering that was real and immediate even though it occurred 1,000 years ago. When we examine their experiences now, we're not engaging in morbid curiosity or wallowing in misery. We're performing an act of witness, saying that their suffering mattered, that their lives had value, that the erasure imposed on them in life and continued after death can be at least partially resisted through accurate historical memory. The ocean that Viking ships crossed still rolls against Scandinavian shores. The fjords they sailed still cut deep into Norwegian mountains. The land endures, largely indifferent to human suffering that plays out on its surface. But we who come after, we who have the luxury of examining this history from a safe temporal distance, we have a choice about how we remember. We can choose comfortable myths that make the past seem less brutal than it was, or we can choose accuracy, can insist on remembering the suffering alongside the heroism, the exploitation alongside the exploration, the women whose bodies were used as property alongside the men whose deeds were commemorated in poetry and stone. I hope this examination has served that more difficult, more honest form of remembering. I hope it's contributed something to recovering voices that were deliberately silenced, to making visible lives that were treated as unworthy of documentation. The frillur can't benefit from our remembering now. They're long gone, their suffering ended by death if not by justice. But perhaps there's value nonetheless in insisting that their experiences be acknowledged, that the true complexity and darkness of history be confronted rather than sanitized for comfortable consumption. And so we've truly reached the end now. The northern twilight fades to darkness. The isolated farmstead grows quiet for the night. The voices we've been listening to, filtered through legal codes and saga fragments, through archaeological evidence and scholarly reconstruction, fade back into the silence from which we briefly summoned them. The women whose experiences we've examined return to their rest, having been remembered for a few hours at least, having had their suffering acknowledged and witnessed. For those seeking sleep, may it come gently now. May the darkness be restful rather than frightening. May your dreams be kind, undisturbed by the difficult history we've explored together. And may you wake tomorrow with the knowledge that you've done something worthwhile. You've spent hours understanding lives that most prefer to ignore. You've honoured people whom history tried to erase. You've chosen difficult truth over comfortable fiction. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about accuracy, about justice, about the complicated truth of human history. Until we meet again for another journey into boring history, I wish you peace, rest, and the quiet satisfaction of having learned something true, even when that truth was hard to bear. Sleep well, dear listener, sleep well.